Hey guys, today we walk straight into a night so cold it crackles canvas snapping like a drumhead tent, cords humming your breath, rising in little silver ghosts, and we ask a question your toes are already begging you to answer. How do you, a winter hunter, in a very simple tent, actually make it till morning without turning into an expensive icicle? You kneel at the threshold where snow squeaks like dry cork beneath your boots, push the flap aside and a bite of air tries to steal your nose. You settle in anyway, because that's the job and the story. It's soothing, it's practical, and if we're honest, you probably won't survive this. Kidding. You will, provided you listen to some people who are very good at not dying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is your location, and local time, so I can imagine which wind is knocking at your window while we camp together. You trudge inside, ducking under smoke that scribbles lazy calligraphy across the air. The tent is simple poles, hides, or canvas some cords, a ground sheet that looks suspiciously like it used to be a reindeer and a ring of stones where the fire sighs. Outside, bells tinkle from the horses or the sled dogs, small bright notes that fold into the long hush of the forest. In here, the soundscape is a soft metronome, tiny pops in the coals, a wheezy whistle where wind sneaks through a stitch you meant to fix the hush of your own parka, rustling as you wiggle into a spot that doesn't feel like ice with opinions. The mainstream fact arrives like a log onto the coal, sleeping warm in winter. Begins not with blankets over you, but with insulation under you. Across cultures that know cold on a first-name basis, the Sami in their lavu, the plains peoples with teepees, the Evenki in Siberia, medieval woodcutters in Europe, you find the same principle stated in every accent. The ground is a thief. You do not sleep on snow. You sleep on a mattress you build between your skin and that white burglar. Spruce boughs, dry grasses, folded hides, a bed of woven willow, anything that traps air and keeps heat where you left it. Tents mattered. Floors mattered more. Hunters collected boughs like currency, fanned them into a springy nest, then layered robes and blankets. Only after the ground was tamed did the night have a chance to be kind. A quirky tidbit pads in on muffled paws, people used dogs as heaters, long before anyone sold luxury hot water bottles. Not just snuggling, as delightful as that is, but strategically. A led dog might be invited to curl at the feet of the eldest sleeper, another against a child's side, a shaggy one at the tent mouth to block drafts. In a few Arctic diaries you catch complaints about dog breath at 3 a.m, followed by reluctant gratitude. Meanwhile, in the forests farther south, hunters roasted small stones by the fire, wrapped them in cloth and slipped them under robes at the core chest, belly kidneys like medieval heating pads. It's hard to feel elegant with a pocket of geology tucked into your waistband, but elegance is an indoor sport. Historians still argue whether fires burned inside winter tents, as often as the romantic paintings suggest. Some point to teepus and lavu with smoke flaps, cones and half cones, designed specifically to host a small hearth safely. They argue that low, well-tended fires were common, and that constant ventilation, a high opening for smoke and a low draft near the snowline made it workable. Others note the very real risks: structural canvas catching stray embers, carbon monoxide. They suspect many groups favoured cooking fires briefly, then banking coals and sleeping with heated stones and extra insulation. The truth likely wandered with weather culture and the stubbornness of the person in charge of the fire that night. Every camp has one. You test the edge of the fire ring with a mitten lifter stone and set it closer to the glow. Outside, wind combs the pines and sends a sift of snow hissing across the ridge. Your tent walls tremble like drumskins. You keep your jokes quiet so you don't spook the heat. The first winter camping is just a spa day where the treatments are confidence and smoke. The second, layers are like friendships, too few and you regret it, too many and you can't move. A third, more honest. If this hot stone slips, I will invent new choreography. Let's walk the scene like a sleepy curator. Your bed a springy grid of spruce boughs, needles pointing away so they don't poke, then a hide, then a blanket. Your clothes not a single heroic parka, but layers linen or wool next to skin to wick away the treachery of sweat. A thicker wool shirt, a quilted coat that traps air, then a shell that bullies wind. Your head and neck covered, your feet. Dry socks you warmed in your jacket before bed. Hunters learned quickly that sweat was the enemy work too hard pitching camp, and you'll spend the night steaming like a dumpling. So you pace the chores, swapping mittens to keep them dry, opening your collar for a minute when you're hot, closing it again before the chill notices. Here's a quiet engineering lesson hiding in the smoke hole you want air to behave like a polite guest. Enter low-rise warm leave high. A wedge-shaped flap lifts on the lee side out of the wind to let smoke slip away. A small gap near the base feeds the fire just enough oxygen. You nudge a stone with your boot. Sparks jump the tent roof, winks amber for a heartbeat, then settles back into blue dusk. That colour, the shift from orange to blue, tells you the burn is clean. You can almost hear some long-ago hunter grumble, "Blue good, headache bad," and you nod because science and common sense share a sleeping bag. Across time, people embroidered warmth into routine. Some cultures sang softly while banking the coal's rhythms measured not in verses but in how long a log takes to catch. Others told the same joke every year on the first true freeze, a ritual charm to persuade winter that you weren't scared. A few tied little bells to the tent guys, not for decoration, but as a draft alarm when all the bells speak your windbreak's failing. Bells at night, wind in the flaps, the ocean-slow crash of distant trees cracking under frost. Tonight's orchestra is weirdly hypnotic. You sip something hot bone broth with a fat sheen that glows like an extra moon. A mainstream fact sneaks in with delicious timing. Fat is portable warmth. Diets in cold hunting seasons skewed oily seal in the Arctic venison, and marrow where forests ruled butter and lard in the European north. Metabolizing fat is a slow burn. Your body hums instead of flickers. Modern aside, it's like upgrading from batteries that die at midnight to the big rechargeable brick you swore you wouldn't lug, and now won't camp without. A fringe tidbit arrives. Steaming some frontier notes claim people lined boots with dried moss, as both insulation and overnight dehumidifier stuff. The boot let it drink your day's mistakes, wake to something less like a swamp. Others talk about sleeping caps long enough to tie under the chin so they wouldn't migrate into soup. Somewhere someone fell asleep with mittens on their feet and socks on their hands, and if that isn't winter comedy, nothing is. Scholars keep bickering gently about whether co-sleeping for warmth was strategy or happenstance. Diaries mention 1 blanket 4 souls nights, and ethnographies celebrate dog-piled families in a noble survival cuddle. Skeptics warn that many of these accounts were recorded by outsiders keen to romanticize primitive coziness, and they urge caution. The likely conclusion: proximity was practical when needed, and personal when tolerated. Some crews slept shoulder to shoulder, others rotated warmth with dogs assigned like night watchmen. You feet duty, you perimeter. The dog union surely had thoughts. You lie back. The spruce boughs creak like old ships. Heat soaks from the stone through your belly and spreads with the lazy confidence of someone who paid the bill in advance. Your eyelids float. The tent fabric ruffles wind's hand, smoothing a wrinkled sheet. You count breaths with the fire's sigh in, with the faint resin smell of spruce out, with the wood smoke that paints the night sky from inside your ribs. Your last waking job is small but ceremonial. A mittened hand checks the flap, the draft, the banked coals. You tuck the hot stone deeper. You confirm your socks have no secret snow in them. You nudge the dog who has annexed more blanket than the treaty allowed. Outside, bells knit themselves into the wind. The snow answers with its own dry whisper. Somewhere the forest shifts like a sleeping whale, slow and massive and completely uninterested in your plans. Tomorrow we'll ask the hard questions, traps to check tracks, to read meat to carry home without losing fingers. Tonight asks only this: can you arrange aircloth fur and fire into a truce until the grey light finds you? You can, but the next duty was even stranger. Before you ever struck a spark, you learned to choose the ground itself, reading wind and snow, the way sailors read the sea, because the wrong campsite can steal more heat than any blanket can give back. You step back outside into the glittering breath of the night, and before you even think about flint tinder or heroic storytelling, you do the least glamorous, most important work of the entire expedition. You pick where to sleep. It sounds simple. Any flat patch will do right, but winter is full of invisible opinions. The wind is voting, the snowpack is voting, the trees are voting, and one of them is campaigning to fall on your tent at 3 a.m. You trudge a slow circle with your mittens tucked under your armpits, letting your eyes adjust to the powdery moonlight and the way the terrain whispers. The bells from the dog team jingle faintly behind you, a tinny metronome for caution. The mainstream fact is as old as the first person who got tired of being miserable. Warmth starts with site selection. You don't camp in hollows where cold air drains like water and puddles. You don't perch on ridges where wind treats you as a practice flag, and you definitely don't tuck in below a loaded slope that's been eyeing you for an avalanche. Hunters across latitudes learned the same geometry in different languages. Choose the lee side of a low-rise to blunt the wind. Look for a natural windbreak, a stand of spruce, a boulder, a kink in the land. Check the skyline for widowmakers, those dead branches poised like swords over sweet-looking flats. The best winter camps cheat the weather with microtopography, a little shoulder of earth, a curve in the trees, a drift that can be carved into a wall. You're not looking for pretty, you're looking for kind. A quirky tidbit skitters by trailing humour like a scarf some hunters spat into the air, to feel which way the wind snatched the warmth from their face-field meteorology with low overhead. Others tied a feather to a stick and planted it like a weather prophet. If it quivered like a nervous chicken, they moved, and there's the old cookie test: set a biscuit on the snow where you plan to sleep. If it slides downhill, your tent will too. It's not peer-reviewed science, but it beats discovering the slope at midnight with your bed travelling faster than your dignity. Historians still argue whether pre-modern hunters systematically read cold air drainage, or simply learned by painful repetition. Some ethnographers emphasise sophisticated indigenous knowledge terms for specific winds, practiced rules for where frost lingers and where it lifts first. Others caution that many detailed prescriptions in later manuals are retrofits, projecting modern microclimate jargon onto habits that were more intuitive and communal. Watch where elders camped to do that. The likely truth is generous knowledge lived in bodies and languages both, and if you sleep warm tonight, it's because you're borrowing memory older than maps. You kneel and press a mitten to the snow. It squeaks a dry high note like a mouse stepping on a violin, telling you it's cold enough for stability, but you still prod with a stick to test the crust. You don't want deep sugar snow that swallows tent stakes, and you don't want glare ice that will conduct your heat straight to the moon. You shuffle to a spot a few steps down from the crest, where the wind shadows, then stamp a rectangle with your boots, snow dancing the practical cousin of ballroom. The dogs approve. Their bells chorus once, then go quiet noses down in curious investigation. Somewhere beyond the trees, the wind lifts and drops, an ocean sound pulled across land. Shoosh. Shoosh, slow, steady, persuasive. Now you build the room the weather will rent from you overnight. First a wind wall, you kick and shovel blocks out of a drift and set them like books on a shelf around the windward side. Snow is a paradox, hostile and air-kind in bricks. It traps heat when you ask politely. If you have time and the mood strikes you, carve a cold trench inside the tent footprint, just a slim slot at the centre, so the densest cold air sinks lower than your sleeping level. You've invented a tiny thermal democracy. The cold gets representation, just not the seat of honour. Then you plan your anchor points. Regular stakes are useless in soft snow. You tie your guy lines around dead men, buried sticks, small sacks of snow, even your extra spoon if you're feeling spicy tucked horizontally under the surface. Snow freezes to them politely and refuses to let go. A modern aside tiptoes in wearing wool socks. This is the winter version of apartment hunting. A pretty view from the ridge grate until the wind punches rent control in the face. A cosy hollow out of the breeze, charming until 3 a.m, when cold air pours in like a scheduled utility. The best place often looks slightly boring: shoulders, sidelines, edges, the architectural equivalent of the friend who brings snacks and never starts drama. You sweep the rectangle flat with a spruce bough, then lay a pad of boughs, neatly needles outward stems, crosswise, making a springy lattice that lifts you out of the world's largest ice chest. Over that hides, or a woven mat. Over that whatever blankets you've hoarded. If you lucked into a patch of dry grasses poking through the crust, you harvest them like a miser, twisting into cords to tuck under your hips and shoulders. Every inch of uplift matters. Every trapped pocket of air is a small savings account you'll cash at 4 a.m. You pause, squinting up at the trees. One leans slightly, bark shaggy crown, bear no bueno. You move the tent by the width of a long joke. This is not fussiness. This is maintenance of life. The bells agree, tink, then silence, as if to say good call. You face the tent entrance away from the prevailing wind, so the flap doesn't become a sail, but not directly downhill because cold air loves a straight hallway. Slightly crosswind does the trick, encouraging a quiet sideways draft to ferry smoke out later. A fringe detail slips in under the flap of memory. Some northern hunters sprinkled a trace of dry ash on their chosen patch, waited a breath, and watched where the specks ran. If ash streaks crawled toward a hollow, they shifted camp. Others lifted a palm of snow blue, then watched the plumes arc, not poetry, just meteorology with better ergonomics. And on lake ice, be careful on lake ice, some drilled a tiny test hole. The sound that came back told them whether they were sleeping over music, thick singing ice, or trouble-thin, sulky creek. Scholarly debate returns in a warm hat with snow walls and Quincy-style shelters, snow mounds hollowed into sleeping caves common for hunters on the move, or mostly a base camp luxury Arctic authors point to the efficiency of igloos and snow pits. For longer stays, their humidity a manageable price for windproof bliss. Others argue that mobile hunters preferred speed a low tent, and a windbreak suffice when tomorrow's tracks dictate a new address. The balance between time and warmth has been negotiated since the first footprint. Your toes will vote shortly. You poke a stick into the crust at shoulder height to mark where your smoke hole will open later. Then listen. Not for wolves or owls, though they're there, but for the little draft sneaking round your ankles, the language of wind rearranged by your new wall. You can actually hear a good pitch. The tent skin hums less. The flap flirts but doesn't argue, and the snow hush near the base thickens like a rug. If a draft keeps nipping your calves, you bank another scoop of snow there. Tents are conversations. You don't win them so much as coax them into harmony. A joke to keep your teeth from clacking winter camping is basically an argument with air about tenancy. Tonight you are the landlord and your security deposit is 4 boughs, 6 dead men and a neat stack of snowbooks. A second joke, because morale is warm, you claim to be roughing it. Then spend 40 minutes building a mattress more carefully than your actual bed at home. A third whispered, so the wind doesn't feel mocked. If comfort were crime, you'd be midway through a heist. You pace your oval, a final time, feeling for mushy spots that might settle at midnight. Anywhere your boot sinks more than a finger, you pack snow in layers, stomp weight, letting it sinter the crystals, hooking elbows as they freeze into a platform. Patience now is sleep later. You plant 2 slender poles as guideposts at the upwind edge. If the squall thickens, you can find your way back from the latrine without inventing an exploratory expedition of 1. Now hydration, the cruel joke of winter. You can't drink cold air. You earmark a drift for clean melting later, and another for utility boots spills dog enthusiasm. Melting snow is expensive heat-wise, so you plan to prime the pot with a splash of liquid, then add snow in handfuls to avoid that baffling scorched nothing, where the bottom heats and the top stays an igloo. You mark the spot with a stick, because in the dark every drift becomes a cousin of every other drift, and you don't want to accidentally season your soup with surprise. The sensory anchors change their cast. The wind is lower here, muffled by your wall. The dog's bells now ring from the periphery tink rehearsing sleep. Somewhere a tree pops the sharp report of sap surrendering to physics, echoing like a distant door slammed by a very polite ghost. Your own breath steadies, and the crunch of snow under your boots softens as your rectangle compacts into a platform. You glance once more at the sky. If clouds have pulled a thin blanket over the stars, the night may be a hair warmer. If it's diamond clear, the radiation will purr heat out of your camp, unless you mind your trenches and walls. You note it the way hunters always have filed, not fretted, and you turn to the pile of hides and cloth that will soon be your roof. Before you raise the tent, you lay out the ground, truth bed first, windbreak second, anchors third, roof last. It's backward to anyone who only camps in fair weather, but tonight you're hosting physics, and physics is picky. You breathe into your mittens and flex your fingers, feeling blood agree to keep cooperating. Somewhere behind you, the lead dog sighs, the universal signal for good spot human. You grin. You'll take the compliment. Now you're ready to plant the centre pole and stretch the fabric into a little universe of your own making. And because you've chosen well everything that follows, Fire Food Stories Sleep has a chance to be civilized instead of heroic. You set the pole cap in its cup, check the line of the canvas, and bend your knees for the lift. But the next duty was even stranger. The warmth on top is nothing without the warmth beneath. So you reach for boughs and hides the oldest mattress in winter's catalogue and learn why insulation under you matters more than the quilt above. You plant the centre pole, pull the canvas up into a little moon of fabric, and then you do the thing that separates I camped from I coped. You build the bed. Not a hero's pallet tossed like a movie prop, but a deliberate stack boughs hides, wool layer by layer until the ground stops behaving like a jealous refrigerator. Tonight's skins matter more than style. If winter fashion had a runway, it would be 6 inches above the snow, and everyone would be lying down. The mainstream fact lands with the quiet authority of a reindeer hide across northern cultures. Animal skins were the foundation of a warm sleep, because hair traps air and air is the only blanket that actually works. The Sami prized reindeer hides for sleeping hair on because each hollow guard hair is a tiny thermos. Inuit caribou hides did similar magic with a two-season system, summer hides, thinner winter hides, plush. On the Eurasian steppe, hunters and herders rolled out sheep or goat skins over a base of brush. In forest belts, deer, elk, or moose hides turned frozen earth into something that forgave your vertebrae. The trick wasn't just having fur, it was orienting it. Hair side up when you want the loft under you, hair side down when you want to slide a top blanket smoothly. Many camps doubled hides like pages in a book, hair facing hair to guard the loft from sweat and friction. If you've ever slept on a foam pad and noticed a miracle from 1 extra centimetre, you understand the physics. Hides were the original centimetres. A quirky tidbit, pads in paws, silent but confident. Some hunters stitched 2 caribou hides back to back with the hair trapped inside, inventing what amounts to a prehistoric down mattress. Others sewed a hide into a tube climbed inside with their boots off, and cinched it with a thong at the chest, a fur burrito avant la lettre. There's also the 2-sock doctrine for hides, 1 thin wool sock to keep skin dry, then a soft hair-on slipper made from leg fur because leg fur is denser, shorter, and less prone to mat than an outer boot. If it sounds fussy, it's only because you've never woken at 3 a.m. when a patch of icy canvas discovers your ankle. Fussy is fabulous when the alternative is dramatic shivering. Historians still argue whether wool blankets displaced fur as soon as trade made them plentiful, or whether fur remained the gold standard for sleep, while woven wool took over the shoulders. Textile historians love to point out the rise of fulled wool, dense wind-resistant in medieval Europe, while Arctic ethnographies insist that nothing beats caribou for lying still without losing heat. Archaeologists complicate it by noting that skins don't preserve well, so we see more tools than bedding in the ground record, while travellers' journals gush about barbaric luxury on fur beds, which tells you more about the traveller than the bed. The likely verdict is situational, where herds were close, and tanning skills were common, fur ruled the floor. Where trade wagons brought bales of cloth and the winters bit less savagely, wool rose politely to the occasion. You kneel on the bow lattice and flop the first hide into place. It fluffs like a patient cat, grateful, slightly smug, and your knees argue with gravity less. You add a second thinking about hair orientation, the way a watchmaker thinks about gears. Hair inward on the bottom, pair hair outward on the top, then a woven layer to protect it from sparks and soup tragedies. You shake out a blanket and it exhales lanolin and wood smoke. Outside wind combs the tent skin with a palm full of sleet. Inside, the texture of the world changes to plush. A softer side to modern life nudges your shoulder, synthetic pads and sleeping bags do good work. But their theory is borrowed trap air, keep it still, keep it dry. The old kits did it with keratin and experience. Also, yes, your puffer jacket is a bird's autobiography. A caribou hide is a tundra in a single layer. You're not obligated to pick an era, you're allowed to appreciate the engineering. You check moisture management like a librarian checks returns. Another mainstream fact wet kills loft. Hunters learned to keep a sacrificial layer woven mat, or a tired old skin between body and best hide to catch sweat. They hung bed skins on a pole during breakfast to let frost sublimate away in the morning sun, and they trained themselves to vent their clothes when working. So the sleeping kit stayed the reward, not the rescue. In some camps, people rotated sleeping spots nightly, so the same patch didn't ice up under the quietest snorer. Yes, you know who you are. A fringe note arrives with a Grinfield notebooks from 18th to 19th century trappers mention rubbing a trace of warm animal fat into cracked leather laces at bedtime, not to moisturize like a spa influencer, but to keep laces supple so a frozen knot didn't become tomorrow's tragic comedy. Elsewhere, winter woodcutters swore by a sleeping cap long enough to tie under the chin so it wouldn't migrate up and abandon the ears. The hat looks ridiculous. The ears vote to keep it. Listen, the tent hum lowers a half tone as the floor fattens. The dog circles once declares your bed legally acceptable and thumps down with a huff of contentment that smells faintly of snow and secrets. Your hand travels the hide's grain, the hair slick one way, firm the other, and you tuck the foot of the bed slightly under itself so wandering drafts have to file paperwork before chilling your calves. The fire pit is still only a ring of cold stones. You'll bring it to life soon, but you've already captured a kingdom's worth of warmth without flame. It's satisfying in an old, stubborn way. There's a joke here, quiet, because warmth is a serious comedian. You mutter that your mattress is ethically sourced from last year's calendar of chores. Another, you've finally achieved a bedtime burrito status, unmatched by modern fitted sheets. And a third whispered to the dog if anyone asks we are rugged individualists who happen to be sharing a fur-lined democracy. You pull a wool layer over the hide and feel the friction between fibres make a static hush, as if the blanket is purring. Overhead the smoke flap waits like a cautious eyelid. You study where your breath drifts. You study where the tent breathes back. A good bed changes the math. Your body burns fewer calories to hold the line. Your mind stops auditing drafts every 6 seconds. And you have attention to spend on the next problem. Fire the nosy roommate who gives heat, borrows oxygen, and sometimes invites drama. Before you strike a spark, one more scholarly squabble taps its pen. Did hunters truly sleep bare skin against fur to maximize warmth, or did most prefer a thin textile layer to manage sweat and itch? Diaries are split. Museum mannequins are optimistic. Common sense suggests it depends on temperature skin timing and whether you like smelling like excellent wildlife. Ethnographers document beautiful skin shirts under parkas in far north winters, but also long wool underlayers where trade allowed. Your solution tonight is diplomatic: a soft shirt, then the fur, then a blanket. Comfort wins elections. You lean back, knees finally forgiven, and the bed lifts you like a raft on a warm tide. The wind outside keeps arguing with geography, but its rhetoric loses power at the hide's edge. Bells from the dog team tick and fade. Somewhere in the trees a branch pops, sending a single clean note through the dark like a conductor tapping a baton. Inside the quiet is thick enough to spread with a spoon. With the ground tamed and the bed civilized, you reach for the tinder pouch. Cedar fluff birch bark, a sliver of resin tucked like a secret. Your fingers flex in their mittens, remembering all the fires they've promised and all the breakfast they've earned. The ring of stones waits for you to give the night a centre, but the next duty was even stranger. A flame inside a tent is warmth, risk and ritual. So you crouch over the hearth and learn how hunters nursed a fire that would glow all night without turning canvas into a headline. You crouch over the hearth you've sketched in stones, and the tent around you becomes a small planet with a molten core. Outside, wind persuades the snowdrifts to move a little, then thinks better of it. Inside, your breath hangs in the air like a drafting note you'll file later. The canvas ceiling bows and unbows a quiet tide. What you're about to do is ordinary and theatrical at the same time. Summon a flame small enough to be safe, steady enough to be useful, and lazy enough to nap along with you. That's a lot to ask from a handful of sticks. The mainstream fact is not romantic, but it saves noses and tents. Winter hunters who used fires inside simple shelters followed a choreography: low hearth, ringed stones, trimmed fuel, and constant ventilation. In Tipi and Lavu traditions, the fire sat at the centre under the smoke opening, never taller than a crouched hand, often with a back built of green logs or a folded hide to behave like a reflector. In ridge tents and lean-tos, the hearth lived just inside the mouth, or immediately outside with a heat reflector wall of logs or snow to fling warmth inward. Everyone everywhere discovered the same ruthless physics. Big fires feel good, and then betray you sparks, puncture roofs, smoke clobbers, lungs, drafts surge and trip embers. Small well-fed fires behave like polite guests. You lay your materials out like a recipe: tinder, birch bark, curls, cedar floss, dry grass, pencil-thin sticks, finger-thick sticks, and a modest stack of limbs cut to wrist thickness. A twig snaps between your gloves with the crisp tick that says dry enough. Your body wants spectacle. Your brain wants control. You scrape a few resin curls with your knife, tuck them into the bark, and strike steel to flint. The first spark is a gossip. The second is a promise. The third finds a soft bed and decides to stay. You lower your face blow like a librarian asking for quiet and watch orange nibble brown. The fire answers with the smallest confidence per tick woof, and you feed it a ladder of sticks until it forgets it was ever shy. A quirky tidbit glows at the edge of memory. Some winter crews carried smudge cones, twisted rolls of birch bark and dry moss, pre-tied with sinew, little one-match fires they could light without drama in wind. Others travelled with a pocket pebble of pitch that they softened near the coals and smeared over stubborn kindling like prehistoric fire starter. In Arctic camps, hunters often used a quollic, a seal oil lamp carved of stone with a wick of moss or cotton grass, when a true wood fire was inconvenient. It didn't roar, but it kissed warmth into space and rendered your breath less lonely. In the boreal forests where wood was plenty but patience was scarce, people shaved feather sticks, spirals of thin curls along a twig so even sulky wood believed it was kindling again. Now you attend to the bossiest character in any tent fire air. You kneel and lift the smoke flapper handspan on the lee side so wind doesn't ram snow into your face. You wedge a short stick under the bottom hem of the tent on the windward side to create a thumb-wide inlet. A quiet draft starts the low door and the high eye persuading smoke to behave like a polite river, not a gossip cloud. You watch the flame colour orange licking into clean blue at the core, a strong steady whoosh when you lean a stick just a hair, a grumpy chuff if you crowd the pile and starve it. No machines, but still a meter your eyes, your nose, the way your temples feel. Hunters didn't say CO levels, they said the fire has opinions. Either way, you adjust before opinions become headaches. Historians still argue whether cooking inside was routine or reserved for truly evil weather. Teepee accounts show families simmering stews over trammels, hung from a tripod, managing smoke with two opposed flaps like eyelids that winked the draft into shape. Lavu narratives are similar low pots, meticulously trimmed sticks, children trained to mind embers like cousins. Other sources insist that many hunting parties cooked outside or in the mouth of the shelter, and then banked a tiny indoor coal nest for ambience and emergency. The archaeological record loves hearthstains and hates precise context. Diaries love cosy scenes and omit the coughing. The compromise reads like you're set up now. If you must cook inside, you shrink scale-open vents and watch like a hawk with a knitting hobby. You shape the hearth. The stones you collected aren't random. They're a ring that does 4 jobs, holds the fire in place, soaks heat to re-radiate later, creates little pockets where embers can bank under ash, and gives your pot somewhere clever to sit. You build a split fire, 2 short rails of wrist-thick sticks with a narrow corridor between so air runs along the channel and keeps the flame low and linear. Over that, a flat stone will eventually hold your kettle, but not yet. You've learned to pre-warm stones at the side of the fire, not over it. Wet or suspect rocks can pop with a bang if heated too fast, and your tent doesn't need stone confetti. Another mainstream trick sneaks in with the smell of pinewood choice is mood choice. Spruce and pine light easily and speak in sparkles dangerous under low roofs, unless you split small and cover coals with sifted ash. Birch burns hot and fast, a fine mid-evening extrovert. Aspen is quieter, a bedtime friend. If you're lucky enough to have dead dry standing limbs not ground-soaked, you make a Q feed twigs for flame maintenance feed fingers, for stability feed wrists for coals. You never dump a log mountain and ask fire to make sense of your laziness. Fire is a conversationalist, not a forklift. The dogs resettle their collars, giving a faint tink when they dream of better rations. Snow hisses on the tent where a gust flings it. The sound is like sand at the beach pretending it's winter. Your sense of humour calls it the seaside of frost. Inside, the fire has found its indoor voice. Shadows of the pole swell and shrink. The ceiling becomes a low aurora of soot ghosts. You hold your mittened hands near the glow and feel something older than language loosen behind your ribs. Then you practice the most unglamorous, most sleep-saving art banking. Hunters tended coals like accountants saving, covering, returning, investing. You let the sticks collapse inward until you have a bed of embers the colour of ripe pomegranates. With a flat stick you ferry a little ash from the ring and sift it lightly over the coals. They dim, then pulse, then hold. Ash is a paradoxical blanket. It smothers flame but insulates heat, letting embers breathe just enough to keep their glow for hours. In the middle of the night, a twist of twig and a whisper of breath bring a new flame like a magician's encore. Banked coals are the difference between 2 a.m. soup and 2 a.m. regret. A fringe practice flickers in from journals when wood was scarce, or stealth-mattered parties sometimes used a candle lantern inside a reflective tin or behind a polished pot. Not for cooking, just for psychology and frost control. A candle lifts the ceiling temperature, a whisper slows rhyme, forming on your blanket edge, and tells your nerves that darkness has roommates. In some steppe camps, folks stacked dung cakes, smoky but steady outside the door, and scraped embers in to light them when morning promised windless sun. Resourcefulness has many scents. Safety intrudes like a stern aunt who is correct. You keep a pot of snow or water within arm's reach, a wooden spoon to sweep stray embers, and a clear rule about boots and coals they do not meet. You place the fuel stash away from the hearth, no matter how seductive right next to it feels to your cold ankles. Before sleep you stir the ring, flick out glow specks with the spoon, until the floor is boring. You check the vents again, the low wedge at the hem, the lifted flap at the crown, and you sit quietly for 30 seconds to listen. A healthy tent fire has a tone, a bass line of ember a treble of twig tick, and almost no cough. Historians still argue about the carbon monoxide risk in traditional shelters, how often sickness struck, whether ethnographic silence equals safety or omission. Modern tests in replica teepees and lav view suggest that with a high smoke exit and low inlet, and with dry fuel trimmed to avoid smoulder indoor levels, can stay modest. But the margin is learned, not guaranteed. The old rules are conservative because their editors were frostbite and funerals. You follow them not from romance, but because they're cheap insurance and you like your neurons. A joke because winter humour is a layer 2 you tell the fire. You're hired as night watch benefits include attention and tiny sticks. Another you glance at the ceiling flecked with soot dots and call them star charts for campers who don't go outside. The dog is unimpressed. He yawns in a way that reveals excellent teeth and a philosophy degree in patience. Now you slide a flat stone over the 2 rails and set your kettle with a shy clank. The water sighs first small bubbles like a secret, then friendly hitches of steam that braid into the tent's breath. You pour a mug of broth that looks like someone melted a sunset and add a thumb of fat. Warmth moves through you like a well-trained courier hand's chest-toes brain. You feel generosity reappear, which is the entire point of heat. The flame dips. You tuck 2 pencil sticks into the corridor and it perks up. Time to consider the night shift, how to make the fire work while you don't. You shape the rails closer, tuck a couple of wrist-thick pieces along the edges, where they'll coast into embers and sift a lace of ash again. You're a banker of red currency. By morning, if you've judged well, you'll find a living heart under the grey. Outside, the wind turns a page. The tent skin answers in a lower key. In the quiet that follows, you feel the oldest math whisper from floor to ceiling: cold wants in, heat wants out. You have arranged a truce. Your eyelids get the message and begin writing their resignation. But the next duty was even stranger. Fires don't last by accident, they last by architecture. So you run your palm over the stone ring and learn the tricks that keep embers breathing till dawn, even when the world beyond the canvas forgets how to be warm. You lean closer to the red glow, watching the little coals gossip among themselves, and you realize that fire is a flirt but also a thief. It gives warmth fast, then takes wood like rent is due. Hunters knew this, which is why the fire ring was never just decoration. Those circles of stone you see in campsites today are heirs of an older strategy stone, as memory stone, as radiator stone, as babysitter. When you ring your hearth with rocks, you're not only containing the flame, you're teaching it a schedule. The mainstream fact in winter camps across Eurasia and the Americas, hunters ring their tent fires with stones that stored and radiated heat. During the evening, blaze those stones drank the fire's energy like thirsty camels. Later, when the flames quieted, the rocks glowed invisibly, releasing slow warmth back into the tent, extending comfort through the coldest hours. Some parties carried a couple of favoured stones from camp to camp, dark basalt lumps or smooth river cobbles that heated evenly and didn't shatter. You might not name them pets, but you gave them jobs. A quirky tidbit in some diaries, trappers describe wrapping hot stones in spare socks or scraps of cloth, then tucking them into bedding. Imagine the prehistoric hot water bottle, except it smelled like yesterday's socks and hissed if you were careless. In other accounts, stones preheated in fire became improvised cookers set under pots to hold a simmer when the main flame was banked. A few groups even placed glowing rocks in snow pits dug near the tent, covered them with hides, and turned them into makeshift radiators that prevented frost from sneaking under the walls. It's not central heating, it's side hustle heating. Historians still debate the safety of this practice. Some point out that heating stones too fast can crack them violently, sending sharp fragments across the tent like midnight shrapnel. Others caution that certain rock types, especially porous ones, explode when trapped water flashes to steam. Ethnographers, however, note that experienced hunters selected rocks carefully dense dry, and often reheated dozens of times. Were explosions rare tragedies or nightly risks? The evidence is patchy, but most scholars agree technique mattered. Choose wrong and you had drama. Choose right and you had warmth until dawn. You range your own hearth now, nudging stones inward with your boot. Their surfaces glow faint red, almost bashful. You test one with a stick, rolling it a little closer to the coals, then set 2 others aside where they'll radiate later. Already you can feel the change. Instead of sharp heat from flame tips, you sense a steady, even pulse around your ankles, a halo of warmth that hums without sparks. Outside, the wind plays cymbals with the tent flaps. Inside, the stones play bass notes you can nap to. The sensory anchors weave themselves in the faint crack of expanding stone, the gentle drip of melting frost from the canvas seam, the metallic tink of your kettle shifting on its perch. You close your eyes and hear the fire as an orchestra flames violining high coals, humming low stones, playing percussion when they pop gently. Somewhere a dog shifts and sighs, collar bell ringing one sleepy note that fades into silence. You laugh softly. Heating rocks for sleep, you mutter, sounds like a spa day designed by geology. Another joke, tonight's bed partner is igneous. A third whispered into your mitten. If I roll onto this by accident, I'll invent a new yoga pose. Winter humour always keeps morale one log higher than despair. The warmth grows steady, but you know the lesson fire alone is a sprinter. Stones are marathoners. That's why hunters bank them carefully, wrapping some for beds, leaving others in the ring, sometimes burying a hot one at the tent's edge, so frost couldn't sneak under. You stack your hides, tug your socks straight and lean back, watching shadows pulse across the canvas. The fire may fade, but the stones will work through the night, whispering stored summer back into your bones. But the next duty was even stranger. Stones and blankets weren't enough. You also had to master layers of clothing that turned sweat wool and hide into the difference between comfort and calamity. You lie back for a moment, admiring the soft radiance of the stones, and then you glance down at yourself. Warm floor, steady coals, loyal dog. None of it matters if your own body is dressed like a confused mannequin. A tent in winter is a test not of muscles or even firewood, but of clothing strategy. You aren't changing outfits for a runway. You're managing layers like a symphony too few, and you freeze too many and you sweat then freeze anyway. Somewhere between frozen popsicle and steamed dumpling hunters through the centuries found their balance. The mainstream fact repeated across cultures and centuries is simple, but often ignored by the overconfident layering clothing strategically as the difference between survival and suffering. Wool closest to the skin to wick sweat. A second wool or quilted layer to trap air. A hide or canvas shell to bully the wind. If you think big coat problem solved, you've missed the lesson. Warmth is built like a wall, many small bricks, not one massive block. Medieval hunters in Europe quilted old scraps into jackets. Sami herders wore tunics of multiple skins cut so seams overlapped like shingles. Steppe riders draped felt cloaks over furs, a sandwich of air pockets. It wasn't fashion, it was engineering. A quirky tidbit sneaks in wearing a cap with ear flaps, 2 long sleeping caps. They sound like bedtime costume, but in frozen tents. They were survival tech. Hunters wore long knit caps that extended to the chest, or tied under the chin, keeping ears and nose from feeling abandoned. Some even stuffed extra wool into the tail, then curled it around the throat like a scarf. In diaries from frontier North America, hunters joke about night hats that made them look like court jesters. But nobody laughed at frostbitten ears. And then there are mittens. One 18th century Russian fur trapper notes proudly that he wore mittens even in bed lest my nails freeze like nails in a plank. He's exaggerating, but not much. Historians still argue about bare skin against fur versus an underlayer of cloth. Some ethnographic accounts insist that direct contact with caribou hide maximised warmth, every hollow hair hugging skin heat. Others counter that sweat builds up quickly, dampening and degrading the hide, and that a thin textile underlayer prolongs both dryness and sanity. The debate trickles into reenactor circles, even now the fur purists against the linen undershirt lobby. The evidence suggests both methods existed, adapted to season activity level and culture. Tonight in your tent you compromise thin wool shirt, then fur, then blanket. Sweat is the enemy, loft is the ally. You peel off your outer coat, shake away the snow crust, and hang it on a line strung between tent poles. Snow hisses faintly as it melts and drops into the ash pan with a tick-tick. You unlace boots carefully. Never let frozen laces rob you of morning toes. Socks you swap into the dry pair you warmed under your jacket earlier. You shake out yesterday's damp hair and hang them near the hearth where heat and draught will court them overnight. Hunters who neglected this chore woke to cardboard socks brittle and accusing. You, however, will slip into warm wool tomorrow like royalty in a cold palace. Another mainstream fact, venting and adjusting layers before sleep. It's counterintuitive, strip a bit before crawling under covers, but it prevents sweat from cooling into clammy regret. Experienced hunters open collars while hauling wood, loosen waistbands before turning in and keep hats at hand to fine-tune heat without undressing. Even modern survival manuals borrow this wisdom: regulate, don't suffocate. You want to sleep like bread rising, not like soup simmering. A fringe tidbit arrives with a smirk in some frontier communities. People stuffed moss or dry grass between their socks and boots for extra insulation. It worked until it didn't. Diaries include complaints about itchy feet full of pasture. Another odd trick, soaking mittens in animal fat, then drying them by the fire. The fat stiffened into a greasy waterproof coating, excellent at repelling snow, appalling for bedtime cuddles. One hunter quipped that his gloves were better dressed for supper than I was. Humour keeps hypothermia from winning the debate. The sensory anchors keep you present. The fire crackles low, stones tick as they cool canvas flutters with wind like a giant book page turning slowly. You shift in your bough bed, and the hides whisper against wool. Even your own breath sounds dressed in layers. Inhale, muffled by scarf. Exhale, cushioned in mittened hands. The dog adjusts, curling closer, the tinkle of his bell muffled by fur. The whole world is swaddled, wrapped, padded, a layered orchestra playing pianissimo. You smile to yourself. Camping fashions show you mutter, but the judges are frostbite and embarrassment. Another joke winter-style tip: always wear 2 socks. One for warmth, one for plausible deniability. And the last whispered into the fire. If anyone asks, this is my thermal couture line. You tuck the edges of your blanket, make sure no skin peeks out, and feel your body sigh into the nest you've arranged. Warmth blooms gradually, evenly, not as a blaze, but as a tide lifting you out of the ground's theft. You know now why hunters layered clothing, carefully slept in hats, swapped socks and banked stones. Each rule isn't about luxury, it's about waking up alive enough to complain about it. And yet as your eyelids drift, you realise warmth under you, and on you still won't save you from the biggest thief, the ground's hunger. That's why hunters laid down spruce boughs thick enough to fool the frost into thinking it had already won. But the next duty was even stranger. Bedding wasn't just soft, it was ground insulation, the secret mattress that turned frozen earth into something survivable. You reach for the first green bough like a stagehand laying out velvet for a tired king, and the forest answers with a quiet resin breath, pine and cold, and a hint of citrus that makes your nose feel emboldened. If you've ever tried to sleep on thin pads or heroic optimism, you already know the rule hunters learned, forgot, relearned, and taught again for centuries: the ground is a thief. It steals heat from you the way a dry sponge steals a spill, silently, thoroughly, without even apologising. Blankets above are a lullaby, insulation below is the contract. So tonight you build a mattress not because you're fancy, but because frost has an accountant's soul, and you refuse to balance your books in the red. The mainstream fact comes in neat, prickly bundles. Spruce or fir bough beds were winter standard from Scandinavia to Siberia to the North American boreal. Hunters layered branches in overlapping courses, butts toward the centre, tips outward, so the needles formed a springy, airy mat that lifted bodies off the snow. Air is the actual insulator. The needles simply corral it. In some regions, people laid a base of brush willow birch twigs and topped it with fragrant spruce or fir, then hides, then a blanket. Others wove quick grids from green saplings to keep the boughs from migrating at 2 a.m, which boughs love to do. The result was a floating floor that turned the world's biggest icebox into something you could negotiate with. Ask any polar traveller who forgot this, once they will tell you a dramatic bedtime story with vigorous hand gestures. A quirky tidbit pokes up like a mischievous branch. There's a folk rule for bough thickness that shows up in journals and trail gossip. Knee thick when standing, hand thick when pressed. Meaning your mat should look outrageously plush. Before you lie down, then compress to a palm's width under your weight. Another delight: some camps scattered sweet gale or dried labdanum where available among the spruce for scent, and in a few traditions to discourage bugs come warmer months. Winter has few insects, but rituals have long memories, and in parts of the north where juniper grew, people slipped a few juniper sprigs into the bed for strong lungs, a household pharmacopoeia that doubles as aromatherapy. Whether it healed or simply cheered is a question for scholars. Your nose already voted cheerful. Historians still argue whether bough beds were universal among mobile winter camps, or primarily a practice where conifers were abundant. Ethnographies from the tundra point out that in truly treeless zones, snow platforms and caribou hide mattresses did the same job without needles. Some archaeologists remind us that plant traces rot. Absence of boughs in the ground record doesn't mean absence in the past. Meanwhile, timberline diaries are explicit: in spruce country you use spruce. The debate settles into a familiar shape: technology follows habitat, habit follows elders, and where trees whisper here, humans weave them into sleep. You get to work with the patience of someone negotiating with physics. First course thick branch butts make the spine of the mattress laid crosswise to your sleeping position. Second course shorter boughs positioned in the opposite direction tips outward, building a crisscross that resists the slow migration of comfort during the night. You press your palm into the mat, springy yes, gaps yes, the good kind of uneven that traps air. Overzealous rookies build bough beds like pancakes flat and eager to squish. You're building a waffle, all ridges and pockets. Waffles win. The sensory anchors stack themselves as neatly as the boughs. Wind hums along the tent skin in long, even syllables. Bells from the dog line ping once, then settle, the tone damped by snow, like a soft hand on a chime. The smell of resin lifts from the crushed tips and decides to live in your scarf for the rest of the week. When you step backward, the mat talks in small squeaks. Snow and needles a duet. And when you sit, the whole platform sighs a little creak that says, "Fine, I will hold you." Now you add hides, or a woven mat above the boughs, hair side up for loft or hair trapped between layers to keep it from matting. You smooth wrinkles the way a ship captain smooths a chart thumb, pressing here and there until the map lies. Your hips thank you in advance. Your ankles sign a thank you card. It's remarkable how fast your nervous system calms when it realizes the ground is no longer siphoning warmth like a tax. You feel taller, though physics denies it. A mainstream footnote: cold trenches. Some winter tent designs include a small trench down the centre line or just inside the entrance, a foot deep, maybe a boot wide. Cold air is heavy. It sinks into the trench and sulks there while your bed, raised by boughs and hides, loafs above it like an aristocrat in socks. Combined with a low intake vent and a high smoke flap, the trench makes a tiny climate machine that whispers, "Heat up here, cold down there." It's not dramatic. Drama is for movies. This is boring excellence. Another quirky trick: snowshoes as bed springs. Travellers short on boughs in sparse forest regions sometimes slid their snowshoes under the hides, webbing side up to add lift and reduce compression hotspots. Was it comfortable? Better than the alternative is the classic answer. There are also cheerful notes about stuffing dry moss into cloth bags to create hip pillows. One French-Canadian journal calls them le coussin de bonhomme, the old man's cushions. The drawing looks suspiciously like a potato sack with ambitions. Scholarly quibbling visits, polite and persistent. Did people truly rotate sleeping spots nightly to let the bough mat recover, or is that a modern guidebook's tidy idea? Some sources mention a bedmaker who fluffed and added boughs while the morning tea brewed. Others are silent, as if the bed maintained itself via witchcraft. Likely answer: in shared camps, someone always tended the bed, because people who fix things also live to complain about the next thing. Maintenance culture is a survival trait. You pause to test, lowering yourself slowly, letting knees and hips find the pockets. You rock once. The bed adjusts like a friendly boat. Compared with the ice, this is luxury. Compared with an inn, it's still a pine-scented negotiation. You slide a hand under your lower back. There's lift, not pressure. Good. You slide a hand under your calves. A little soft. You add one more bow crosswise and the platform evens. You're not perfectionist. You're energy efficient. Every minute invested now is 30 minutes you won't spend awake composing angry letters to cold. A modern aside steps lightly in wool socks. Foam pads do in centimetres what bough beds do in branches. Closed cell pads resist moisture and crush. Inflatable pads loft high, but can hiss your hope away at 2 a.m. when a microleak turns them into a very honest tarp. Hunters didn't argue about our values. They argued with their backs. Your bough bed is the analogue original, repairable, silent, fragrant, politely compostable when you move on. Leave it scattered, not piled, so the forest can pretend you were never here. Jokes keep morale from icing over. You pat the bed and murmur, 5-star forest accommodation, breakfast included if I remember to thaw it. Another to the dog, now eyeing your pillow. This suite comes with a complimentary wolf alarm and a strict no-chewing policy. And finally, to no one in particular. Between the waffles and the fur, I'm a very dignified sandwich. Laughter is a small stove you carry in your lungs. You tuck the bed's edges under the tent wall so stray drafts have to work harder. You slide your boots just inside the entrance, upside down so they don't drink snow like fools. You set tomorrow's socks inside your coat to pre-warm with the most reliable heater. You own your own metabolism. The kettle plinks once, twice, settling into contentment on the stone rail. When you lie back, the boughs lift you the width of a hand from the earth's appetite. The difference between cold and kept is suddenly measurable in millimetres. One last historical whisper in some camps: the youngest gathered boughs, the eldest placed them. Not hierarchy so much as efficiency, the elders knew where hips complain at dawn. In others, everyone threw down branches, then a single picky genius rearranged them to applause and groans. Those are the people who in modern offices straighten crooked paintings without breaking eye contact. Bless them. Your spine owes them rent. You close your eyes to test the system. The draft brushes your cheek but doesn't bite. The stones pearl warmth. The boughs breathe back. The tent smells like a winter chapel, smoke and resin and wool. Somewhere beyond the forest cracks a knuckle, one clean pop that echoes and vanishes. Your bed answers with a small creak that means nothing and everything I hold you. You're allowed to sleep. But the next duty was even stranger, even with perfect boughs and hides. Warmth multiplies when bodies cooperate, so you turn toward the old practical intimacy of sharing heat, in tight spaces from family piles to faithful dogs, and learn why winter tents were crowded on purpose. You shift on the pine waffle mattress and feel that pleasant sneaky warmth bloom, where your back meets the hides, and then you remember the most unromantic, relentlessly effective heater a winter hunter ever had another human being. Romance optional, proximity non-negotiable. In the catalogues of cold blankets, rank high fires rank higher and bodies rank unfairly high, because biology cheats in your favour. Tonight the tent is a democracy of metabolism, and you're about to hold elections with your elbows. The mainstream fact folds in like an extra quilt across subarctic forests. High plateaus, prairie winters and mountain hunts shared body heat. 2 to 4 people sleeping close under the same cover was standard practice when the mercury got stubborn. Sami families in the Lavu Plains, hunters in a teepee Siberian evenki in conical tents, alpine woodcutters in huts, frontier trappers in lean-tos, medieval charcoal burners in quick shelters. It wasn't cuddling for poetry, it was thermodynamics with manners. One large blanket, a fur robe big enough to tent the tent, a buffalo robe doubled over, pull everyone under feet tangled like a polite nest, and let the maths of mammalhood do its job. The rule was as old as sleep share, heat share, survival. A quirky tidbit grins its way under the covers. Many camps observed a sleep order that made practical sense and produced 1,000 arguments. The coldest sleeper a child, someone recovering, the person who always swears they're fine while turning blue went in the middle. Hot sleepers, those blessed furnaces who steam even at funerals, took the edges or foot positions where drafts prowl. Some groups practice spoon rotation, a slow, sleepy choreography where everyone gently turns together every so often, redistributing cold spots and keeping the top layer sealed. In a few diaries you catch the inevitable comedy someone always flips independently, and suddenly the whole group resembles misfiled cutlery, accompanied by groans and a whispered negotiation worthy of diplomats. Historians still argue about how universal this co-sleeping was among hunting parties versus family camps. Ethnographers point to explicit customs, Sami terms for sleeping positions, Plains etiquette about who shares which robe, Arctic notes on a child in the warm seam. Military histories cite Napoleonic soldiers in Bracero, sleeping 3 to a blanket during winter campaigns to avoid freezing before dawn. Skeptics counter that many of these sources were written by outsiders who romanticized primitive snugness or overgeneralized from emergency conditions. The likely middle truth proximity was common when cold required it, and it followed rules, kinship rank, comfort consent shaped by each culture and situation. The physics didn't care, the people did. You make your own micro-negotiation under the tent tonight. You slide closer to your partner in the hunt, the quiet one with the steady laugh and infuriatingly warm hands. You both keep your hats on because ears don't get participation trophies, and you tuck the edge of the fur under your shoulders so drafts must invent excuses. You pass the hot stone, carefully hitching it with a scrap of cloth toward the center of the blanket cave, setting it near the core, where it will do the most good without auditioning for a brand. Immediately, the temperature inches up from "we will prevail" to "we might nap." Sensory anchors change key. It's not wind and bells now, but breath and fabric. The canvas roof hushes. The hides exhale that faint animal loft smell that feels older than language. The shared blanket makes a slow shuff when both of you readjust. Outside, the dog line gives one collective tink and subsides. Somewhere a tree pops with a tidy crack ice shrugging its shoulders, and the sound arrives filtered through snow softened as if the night edited it for sleep. Your own heart tones down from drum to metronome. Another mainstream truth sleeping close wasn't just warm, it was insurance. Someone waking to stoke coals could check that everyone else was still breathing like tired kettles. In family tents, night watch was shared. In hunting pairs, the colder one got the first watch, the hotter one took the dawn. If a seam came loose or a draft found a sly path, 4 hands fixed it faster than 2 numb ones. And yes, in some places a watchdog slept at the flap, and a watch child, the kid who wakes at the slightest hinge, squeak caught every errant ember and flapping tie. No one trains them. The universe just assigns the role. A fringe practice slips a socked foot into the storyfoot stones, and kidney stones, the friendly kind, were distributed like rations, one near feet, one near the small of the back to warm blood where it makes a difference. On intensely cold nights, hunters swore by the belly band, a strip of wool or fur tied around the abdomen under the outer layers before bed. It looked silly, felt lovely and made sense. Warm guts, warm everything. There are also notes about stuffing a dry mitten between knees to reduce radiant heat loss and stop joints from squabbling all night. The mitten wakes confused but honoured. A modern aside knocks politely on the tent pole. You've probably heard of the buddy system in cold weather camping. Share a bag or zip 2 together, keep a vapour barrier between you and the down, and accept that the sound of someone else's snoring might be the lullaby that saves your toes. In a world trained to chase individual gear solutions, the most boring answer remains the most powerful friends are warm. Not just emotionally, though yes, but thermally. Civilization begins when we share blankets and chores. Winter just enforces the syllabus. Humour is a layer too, you whisper. Congratulations, we're now a community heating system. Your partner replies, great, I'm billing you for utilities. Later, as you both attempt that dignified, synchronized role, someone's elbow narrates the move with a squeak that could make saints laugh. You add a clause to tonight's treaty: if one person steals the blanket, the other steals the hot stone. Equity achieved. Scholars keep nibbling at the edge of evidence about gendered sleep arrangements in hunting contexts who slept, where how modesty rules flexed under cold pressure. Some sources note strict partitions in mild seasons that relaxed when temperatures plunged. Others insist partitions were ritual, not physical, and warmth sharing followed kin lines unless true emergency intervened. Field notes also record polite euphemisms: the women and small ones slept by the heart of the lodge, that say everything without an argument. The constant is respect plus physics. If either failed, the camp got grumpy and the day got shorter. You perform the blanket tuck that every elder ever insisted on: edge under shoulder edge, under hip edge, under partner's hip, and a final sweep over both hats. Drafts for tonight at least have to write applications. Under the quilt, small eddies of cool air turn into merely interesting weather noticed, not feared. You feel fatigue finally outvote vigilance. Even your toes, those tiny contrarians, sign the armistice. Before sleep finishes its paperwork, you rehearse tomorrow's wake-up choreography. The early riser, maybe not, slides an arm out, fishes a pencil stick, cracks ash with a spoon, and coaxes the ember bed back to orange with 2 breaths and 1 unreasonable prayer. The other person tightens the blanket seal to save what warmth lingers. 2 minutes later, the kettle purrs, and the tent remembers optimism. This routine has about 1 million birthdays. A last small, unprovable but charming claim turns over like a warm pebble. Some elders swore that stories told under the blanket warmed you faster. Science says that's probably psychology. Your body hears a voice you trust, relaxes, and stops burning frantic calories. Either way, the tale begins something about a trapline, a fox too clever, and a moon that lost interest, and by the 3rd sentence your shoulders have dropped another centimetre. Heat enjoys being believed in. The night pads around your little hut sniffs at the seams, gives up and lopes away. You drift at the speed of embers slow and orange. Breath fabric, an old duet. Outside, the dog at the flap rearranges himself with a small woof, a question mark of sound, and settles chin on paws, eyes on winter's gossip. But the next duty was even stranger. Humans are fine radiators, but the finest heaters in a hunter's camp often had paws and a tail, so you slide a hand toward a familiar scruff and learn why dogs curled beside sleepers could turn lethal cold into merely interesting weather. You roll onto your side, the fur creaks faintly under you, and a warm shape presses closer. Not a person this time. You reach and your hand sinks into a coat even thicker than any hide you own a coat, that comes with teeth, ears, and Loyalty the dog. If hunters were mathematicians of heat, dogs were the bonus equation nobody argued with. A human body is a radiator. A dog is a stove with fur that sighs. The mainstream fact is clear in almost every hunting tradition from Lapland to Labrador. Dogs, curled beside sleepers, kept hunters alive on frozen nights. In Arctic igloos, Greenland dogs line the floor like a furry mattress, humans above warmth rising through two species. Among the Sami reindeer herders often shared hides with their dogs not as sentiment but as insulation, each dog a 20-kilogram hot water bottle with opinions. North American trappers counted on sled dogs to fill gaps at their feet, or flank their combined breath, lifting the inside temperature of a tent by several degrees. Dogs weren't luxury, they were infrastructure. A quirky tidbit trots in tail wagging. There are journals that mention hunters rotating dogs like firewood. The strongest pulled sleds all day and still curled near the entrance at night, blocking drafts. The younger or smaller curled inside against the hunter's chest or legs, warming the weak points. Some camps joked about assigning dogs to foot duty or kidney duty. A few even mentioned dogs sneaking into blankets entirely nose to tail, leaving their owners grumbling about fur taxes while enjoying the heat. One diary from a 19th century trapper even claims that dogs would argue for position growling lightly until the hierarchy of warmth was settled. Humans did not always win. Historians still debate whether this kind of co-sleeping was intentional practice or simply natural consequence. Some anthropologists argue that ethnographers overemphasize dog as heater, when in many communities the animals slept near people for bonding and security first, warmth second. Others counter that oral traditions explicitly describe placing children between dogs in the bitterest nights. Archaeological remains of dog burials with blankets suggest more than practical companionship, it was partnership, warmth woven into survival and story. Scholars keep circling the same campfire with dogs, family tools or both. The answer is yes. You test it tonight, leaning against the furry stove at your side. The dog sighs, the bell on his collar gives one last faint tink, and then he curls tighter, spine pressed to your shin's chin on his own paws. Instantly your toes feel a reprieve. You hadn't realised how much they complained until they stopped. The tent air seems less cruel. Even your shoulders relax as if one dog can radiate reassurance across joints he's not even touching. The sensory anchors shift no longer just the fire's tick and the wind's shh, but the steady huff of canine breath. A faint warmth drifts upward from the animal's core, mixing with your own trapped under the furs. The smell is honest fur and snow and whatever he last rolled in, but in winter, honesty is comfort. The outside forest cracks again, but now you hear it filtered through his ears first. His body stiffens, then loosens. The world has a guard. You have permission to nap. A fringe tidbit. Some frontier accounts describe dogs wearing little coats of hide or wool to protect them from frost at night, so they could still share warmth without losing their own. Other notes mention feeding dogs extra fat in the evening, ensuring their bodies ran hotter through the night, a metabolic heater disguised as supper. In a few cases, hunters even deliberately laid dogs along tent seams to prevent drafts, essentially furry sandbags with enthusiasm. The line between pet partner and survival gear blurs until it disappears. You joke quietly to yourself. Congratulations, I'm sharing my bed with a four-legged radiator. Another, this heater runs on bones and occasional disobedience. The last whispered into the dog's ear, if you hog the blanket, I'm writing you up. He doesn't care. He's asleep, breath steady, job done. Modern campers sometimes forget this ancient technology. They carry insulated pads, battery-powered heaters, silver blankets. All clever, all heavy, none with wagging tails. The buddy system extends beyond humans. Sometimes survival meant letting a warm, stubborn, loyal creature crawl into your life, your tent, your furs. Warmth was never just physics, it was partnership. The tent feels smaller now in a good way. The fire whispers lower, stones tick slower, and under the furs the dog's warmth spreads like a rumour you're glad to believe. Your toes unclench, your eyelids follow. Outside, the night exhales, but you're shielded by fur and heartbeat and breath. But the next duty was even stranger. Warmth wasn't just trapped in furs and hides. It could be bottled, carried, and slipped into bed as if hunters had invented the prehistoric hot water bottle. You ease one arm out from the blanket cave fingers, testing the tent air like a cautious swimmer dipping toes in a glacial lake. The fire's down to a pomegranate glow. The dog is a furred comma punctuating your shins, and your brain is writing a polite letter to your feet. Please be less Antarctic. Time to deploy the most ancient luxury on the winter menu heat you can hold. Not a battery, not a boiler, a rock. Specifically a hot stone wrapped like a gift for your circulation. The mainstream fact for thousands of cold seasons, hunters, herders and winter travellers used heated stones baked beside the fire, then swaddled in cloth bark or hide as portable radiators to warm beds and bodies. In subarctic forests, small river cobbles were favoured dense, smooth and less likely to crack. In steppe camps, flat field stones were nudged near coals until they held a steady, deliberate heat. Arctic families where wood was scarce sometimes used soapstone warmed by lamps then wrapped and tucked into blanket folds like tame sons. The method is simple physics plus simple kindness. Stone soaks heat. Cloth slows release. Your core says thank you without words. A quirky tidbit hums in from old notebooks. Frontier trappers swore by kidney stones, the good kind nestled at the small of the back to warm blood where warmth spreads best. Others issued footstones like rations, placing one near the ankles and one at the belly, then declaring the camp officially civilized. A few 18th century diaries mention stones wrapped in socks, yes, yesterdays, because woven wool both cushioned and wicked damp. There's even a wink of satire from a bored woodcutter who claimed he tied a stone inside a hat and wore it like a thinking cap. Did it help with philosophy? Only with the part that says warm equals good. Historians still argue about safety and technique. Which stones? How hot? How wrapped? Field experience says, avoid wet porous rocks. They can pop dramatically as steam builds inside. Choose dry dense stones, granite basalt river cobbles, and pre-warm at the edge of the hearth, not in the middle of a blaze. Wrap in layers first, a scrap of damp-resistant bark or leather if you have it, then wool or cloth. Skeptics remind us that period accounts are biased towards success. The nights when a stone scorched a blanket rarely earned poetry. Yet the practice persists across cultures and centuries because it mostly works, and because the alternative is a long conversation with frost. You pick your candidate from the ring, a palm-sized oval the colour of rain clouds, surface just shy of too hot. With a stick, you roll it onto a square of cloth fold once twice, then cinch with a spare thong. Already the hiss of warming fibres fills the tiny universe under your blanket. The stone's weight is reassuring, not heavy, but purposeful, as if it remembers the sun and intends to lend you a chapter. You slide it gently to the belly above the navel, where warmth convinces the rest of you to follow orders. The effect is immediate. Your spine loosens, your shoulders demote their concerns, your toes file a report that says we have rejoined the organization. The sensory anchors lean in close. The tent canvas gives a soft, papery rustle with each wind push. The embers answer with a faint tinkle when a twig fractures into coal. The wrapped stone speaks in micropops as trapped fibres shift and settle. Heat travels like news quiet at first, then everyone's talking. Under the hides, the dog emits a single satisfied huff. Apparently he approves of thermal policy. Another mainstream detail placement matters. Hunters learned to warm the core, first belly kidneys, then manage the extremities. A hot stone at the feet provides local joy, but if your centre's cold, your body will shut supply lines, and your toes will stage a walkout. So you warm the belly for 5 minutes, then shuttle the bundle to the feet, then back to the kidneys and exchange program of heat. Meanwhile, a second smaller stone can live at the sternum under a layer a third at the thighs if the night is particularly enthusiastic. It's not gadgetry, it's choreography. A fringe practice arrives from the margins. In some steppe camps, people filled a leather pouch with hot sand or small pebbles, which held warmth more evenly than a single stone and draped better across joints. Elsewhere, families kept a bed brick, a fired clay block that lived by the hearth, and was ceremonially wrapped at bedtime, then shared among sleepers like a crown jewel. A few accounts even mention salt bottles, sheepskin bladders filled with warm brine, sealed tight, and slipped into bedding. The chemistry checks out salt water holds heat a little differently, but also wants to express itself if you mistrust your knots. Many quilts learn this the hard way. Here's the modern aside tiptoeing in on down socks. This is the ancestor of your hot water bottle, and the cousin of those microwavable bean bags someone always gifts you at holidays. The principle hasn't aged a day. Stone water grains, thermal mass is bedtime's best friend, especially when fire needs a break. You're simply doing it with rocks and rhythm which feels satisfyingly low-tech and deliciously effective. You rewrap the bundle, heat has already wandered, but inside the cloth, the stone is still generous. You ferry it to the feet, tuck it between 2 layers so it doesn't brand your enthusiasm, and feel that wave rush along the arches, up the calves, right into the argument your knees have been muttering all evening. Your brain, which a minute ago was inventing tragic sonnets about circulation, changes the subject to pastries or warm kitchens, or the first sun puddle on the camp path. Heat edits thoughts. That's its other job. Humour puts on a wool cap. You whisper, "Congratulations, Rock, you're promoted to senior thermal consultant." Another line to the dog, "Don't worry, you're still head of warm morale." A third for your own entertainment. If I fall asleep hugging a stone that's geology's business, winter comedy is small, local, and extremely effective. Safety taps your shoulder again, gentle but firm. You keep the stone wrapped and moving. No raw rock against skin. No nap with the bundle wedged under a rib. And you park the bundle away from the canvas wall, which has a habit of melting, frosting, and scolding, all in one night. Before sleep deepens, you crack the ash lace over the coals to be sure nothing flares if a draft sneaks under. The tent breathes low intake at the hem exhale at the smoke eye. Your lungs approve their opinion counts. Historians still debate how many hot stone bundles a typical winter camp used. Some suggest one per sleeper on truly vicious nights. Others propose a communal pool of 2 or 3 rotated among 5 or 6 people, trading warmth like a polite card game. Ethnographic silence here may just mean the practice was too boring to note precisely the kind of unremarkable excellence that saves fingers and rarely makes it into poetry. Scholars also quibble about stone choice river cobbles versus fieldstone versus carved soapstone. Evidence points to habit plus availability, with a lot of use what doesn't explode as the prevailing peer review. You run a hand over the blanket edge, tucking it like a baker tucks dough under itself. The stone has wandered again, less heat now, but still aglow, so you park it at the kidneys for a last drowsy favour. The ember bed sighs. A tiny constellation of red winks at you from the hearthrug. Outside, wind draws its sleeve across the trees, and the forest replies with a low creel, almost oceanic. It always comes back to water, even when frozen steam in the pot frost on the canvas melt in the stone's core. One last quirky whisper. Some camps scented their wraps with spruce tips or a thread of juniper smoke before bundling stones a nonsense-sounding luxury, until you feel how scent adjusts the brain's thermostat. Warmth plus resin equals safe. Call it aromatherapy, call it a bribe for the nervous system. Either way it works. You edge closer to the dog. He allows it magnanimously because you are after all part of his pack and therefore entitled to several square inches of shared climate control. Your breath and his fall into a shared cadence. The stone's last heat lingers in your core like a secret you intend to keep till dawn. And just as comfort proposes a truce, another memory taps warmth inside the tent is only half the battle. Outside, the wind keeps filing appeals. Hunters long ago learned to stack winter against itself, raising snow walls and sculpting drifts into allies, so that air arriving at your shelter forgets how to misbehave. But the next duty was even stranger. You step back into the night with a shovel and learn how snow walls as windbreaks turn the cold itself into your quietest bodyguard. You duck out of the blanket cave boots crunching against the packed snow at the tent's edge and discover that the night has opinions. Wind prowls around camp like a nosy neighbour, tugging at the canvas seams, flinging small knives of frost at your cheeks. You're already warm inside, but the tent is only fabric, and fabric without allies is gossip waiting to become scandal. That's why hunters learn to build snow walls, not barricades of romance, but windbreaks that turn the enemy itself into a bodyguard. The mainstream fact hunters and herders across snowy continents use snow walls, berms, and sculpted drifts to block or deflect wind from their shelters. A low tent pitched in the open is at the mercy of every gust. Add a waist-high wall of packed snow on the windward side and suddenly the wind forgets how to bully. Arctic Inuit cut blocks with snow knives, stacking them like bricks in a gentle arc. Plains hunters scooped drifts into curved banks against teepee skirts. Siberian Evenki kicked loose snow into mounds tamped with boots and froze them into stubborn bulwarks overnight. The method is simple. Physics break the wind's back before it hits fabric. A quirky tidbit swirls in like spindrift. Some camps shaped snow walls not as straight lines but as curves echoing a crescent moon. The curve funneled air harmlessly around instead of over-reducing turbulence at the tent. Others decorated the tops with spruce boughs, not for art, but because branches disrupted snow devils, preventing them from sneaking under seams. A frontier journal even mentions using sleds turned on their sides and banked with snow to form instant barricades, transport by day, architecture by night. One clever party supposedly lined the inside of their snow wall with fish nets to catch drifting flakes thickening the barrier as the night wore on. Free maintenance from the storm itself. Historians still argue about how elaborate these walls really were for short-term hunting trips. Some say the grand igloo-like rings you see in paintings were mostly base camps or ceremonial sites. Others point to field notes from military scouts, fur brigades, and explorers describing hasty half-circles of snow tall as a man raised in less than an hour. Archaeologists have found faint rings of compacted snow layers in tundra soil, evidence of repeated use. The debate isn't about whether they existed, but how often and how formal. Likely answer: improvisation ruled. If the wind was brutal, walls grew tall. If it was calm, hunters skipped the drama and trusted hides. You stamp a circle, scoop snow with mittened hands and feel it squeak under pressure. Dry, brittle crystals bonding as you pile. Kick, pack, stomp, repeat. The sound is a muffled drumline thud, crunch, hiss. The dog watches unimpressed until he decides to help by digging a hole in exactly the wrong spot. You thank him for his contribution. The wall rises slowly, uneven, but purposeful. Waist-high will do high enough to make drafts detour low enough not to collapse under their own ambition. The sensory anchors wrap around you. Wind's voice dims as the barrier thickens. Your shovel's edge makes a hollow shk as it slices. Snowflakes sting your eyelashes, melt, and whisper tick as they slide. The tent flaps, then quiets, already grateful for its new friend. Even your breath changes tone, less snatched, more steady. Architecture has consequences. A fringe tidbit: in some Sami traditions, children were taught to read snow hardness by sound tap with a stick. Listen for hollow or solid. Only the solid made good walls. Hollow drifts betrayed you by slumping at midnight. In northern Japan, Ainu hunters sometimes built yukimuro snow mounds meant both for storage and shelter, doubling as windbreaks for tents or huts. Across the Atlantic, military manuals in the 18th century recommended snow redoubts for soldiers, functional fortifications that doubled as cozy windshields for bivouacs. Snow, it seems, is both enemy and ally, depending on who does the sculpting. Modern aside, if you've ever crouched behind your car on a windy day, you've tasted the principle. It's not the canvas that saves you, it's the shadow of stillness created by structure. Snow is just a more cooperative car if you pile it right. You joke to yourself, "Look at me sculpting frozen air like a winter architect." Another line. When life gives you snow-build real estate, and alas whispered with a grin. Some people collect trophies, I collect windbreaks. Humour is the mortar in your wall. You smooth the top edge with your mitten, patting it down like dough. The wall gleams faintly under moonlight, every crystal flashing a tiny vote of confidence. Back inside, you notice the difference immediately. The tent skin no longer thrums like a drum, but breathes gently as if it exhaled relief. You pull the flap closed, tuck your boots back near the hearth, and feel smug your bed will be warmer. Not because you added heat, but because you subtracted wind. But the next duty was even stranger. Tents were not just circles of cloth. They were design puzzles, and hunters built cones, lean-tos, and hide shelters that made winter nights survivable in ways modern engineers still admire. You sit back on your heels and study the canvas, the poles, the ropes humming faintly like harp strings when wind plucks them. A tent in winter is not just a roof, it's a piece of engineering, where shape decides whether you wake comfortable or spend dawn telling tragic stories about drafts. Hunters didn't build for beauty. They built cones, lean-tos, domes, and hides stretched tight, each design a quiet answer to the same question. How do you persuade cold air to go elsewhere? The mainstream simple tent designs evolved in many cold weather cultures, converging on similar forms, because physics is a bossy architect. The cone seen in Sami-Lavu, North American teepee, and Siberian chum is aerodynamic, stable, and vented. Wind climbs up and over instead of tearing through. Lean-tos, favoured by solitary hunters or quick travellers, provided a slanted wall that reflected fire heat back into the shelter, often paired with a snow wall on the open side. Dome-like snow tents woven with hides or bark mats maximised interior space and resisted collapse. The common thread was always simplicity: portable, faster pitch, able to take a beating without needing a cathedral's worth of lumber. A quirky tidbit pokes its head in, wrapped in hide. Some hunting tents used reversible skins, fur inward on bitter nights, fur outward when weather was milder to adjust insulation. Others used poles intentionally cut uneven so the cone leaned slightly. This controlled how smoke exited and how snow slid off. One Sami account even describes tilting the lavu just enough to face sunrise, so morning light struck the doorway and encouraged late sleepers out of their fur cocoons. That's not physics, that's alarm clock by architecture. Historians still argue over efficiency versus portability. Some ethnographers claim nomadic hunters prized the cone shape not only for warmth, but because it packed small poles, bundled hides, folded nothing wasted. Others note that in wooded regions, hunters often built improvised lean-tos from branches and bark, choosing speed over ideal airflow. Archaeologists point to stake holes and soil stains trying to reconstruct tent geometry, like detectives with only footprints. And then there are paintings, some exaggerated, some accurate, showing elegant towering teepees in deep snow. Raising the question, did hunters really sleep in shelters that neat, or is art just tidying reality? Scholars shrug and remind us survival makes its own style guide. You trace a line along the pole, feel the tension of the rope, the way the hide flexes. The tent is not merely overhead, it's a skin between worlds, thin enough that you hear the snow hiss thick enough to confuse frost. You press your palm to the wall, it's cold but not biting thanks to the snow berm you built outside. You imagine the cone shape deflecting gusts like a shrug, the lean-to catching firelight like a mirror, the dome stubbornly hugging heat like a miser. Every culture's design was a thesis paper in survival. The sensory anchors join the lecture, the creak of poles when the wind leans, the flutter of the canvas flap gentler now, the smell of resin lingering in the rope knots, the faint whine of rope fibres tightening under frost. You hear not just the night but the tent itself alive, tuned, participating in your rest. Another mainstream point: ventilation mattered more than insulation. Cones had smoke flaps at the top. Lean-tos were angled to allow draft control. Domes used small vents or half-open seams. Without fresh air, warmth killed as surely as cold. Hunters learned to read smoke like scripture. If it pooled and sulked, vents were wrong. If it streamed upward and vanished, vents were right. Even today, modern replicas show how a small steady flame inside a cone tent can hold interior temperatures dozens of degrees above the raging blizzard outside. A fringe practice shows up in travellers' notes. Some hunters stitched double-wall tents, an outer hide acting as windskin, and an inner as thermal coat with snow or air trapped between. This was heavier, less portable, but in long winter, hunts worth the labour. Elsewhere, canvas or hide was treated with oil or fish fat to shed water and resist stiffening. The tent smelled like a fish market, but it stood proud in freezing sleet. Diaries describe visitors grimacing while locals shrugged and slept warm. Modern aside, think of your winter coat. Shell outside insulation, inside vents you adjust depending on whether you're trudging uphill or loafing at a fire. Hunters had no Gore-Tex or synthetic fill, but the logic was identical. Tents were coats for groups. Some even joke they were wearing the house since the house travelled folded on their backs. You smile in the half-light, muttering Fashion Week Tippy edition. Another joke slips out. My house has one room, one window and no rent, eat that landlord's. The dog doesn't laugh, but his ear twitches as if approving sarcasm. A third, it's not glamping if your chandelier is a smoke hole. The tent groans softly, stretching against its own knots, and you feel absurdly grateful. It is a humble cone, a humble hide, a humble lean-to, yet it has turned frost into quiet wind, into lullaby canvas, into comfort. Without it, you'd be a question mark in the snow by dawn. With it, you are a sentence that continues. But the next duty was even stranger inside these shelters. Hunters cooked carefully, turning meals into warmth while juggling the risk of smoke and flame. So you lean toward the coals and discover how cooking inside tents was both salvation and hazard. You lean forward, sliding your mittens off for a moment, letting your bare fingers flirt with the sting of the air while you adjust the stones and embers. The night has been patient, but your stomach is not. Hunters in frozen landscapes always faced this next duty with mixed feelings cooking inside the tent. Comfort food on one hand, suffocation and sparks on the other. It was survival, yes, but also theatre you juggle, flame, smoke, hunger, and hope, all in a space smaller than most closets. The mainstream fact: many winter hunting cultures cooked inside their shelters when weather demanded it. The Sami lavu, the plains teepee, the Siberian chum, all had a central hearth, where food simmered, heat rose, and smoke crept out through carefully managed flaps. Meals weren't just calories, they were warmth factories. A pot of stew radiated heat for hours, its steam humidifying the air so noses didn't crack like old leather. Hunters didn't just eat around the fire, they lived with it as a third roommate. A quirky tidbit bubbles in Arctic camps people use seal oil lamps quillic, not only for light but to melt snow for water and cook small meals without roaring flames. The lamp gave off a gentle, steady glow that mothers used for tea and broth, the same lamp that dried mittens overnight. In medieval European hunting huts, some cooked porridge in pots, suspended from tripods over embers, joking that it was smoke-seasoned. And in frontier North America, hunters often boiled coffee so strong that even the tent pole stayed awake. Diaries mention cowboy coffee brewed directly in tin pots, over coals strained by luck more than cloth. The results were bitter but warm, and that was enough. Historians still argue about how safe these indoor kitchens really were. Some scholars insist that most food preparation happened outside, when conditions allowed with indoor cooking reserved for blizzards. Others point to structural evidence soot stains on tent poles, fire rings carefully maintained in the centre, and ethnographic testimony that indoor cooking was common, even routine. The truth likely varies. Short-term hunting tents may have relied on outside fires, while long-term family camps cooked indoors out of necessity. Archaeologists even note differing soot patterns depending on region, suggesting cultural variation in how venting was managed. You bend and set the kettle back on the stone rails. It sighs, releasing steam that fogs the low ceiling and leaves beads of the moisture trembling on the canvas seams. You drop in chunks of dried meat and grain, watching them soften into something that resembles supper. The smell blossoms, rich, fat, earthy broth, a whisper of smoke, and the whole tent seems to inhale with you. The dog lifts his head, ears forward, eyes promising impeccable manners if you remember his share. The sensory anchors multiply the plink of fat hitting. Coals, the slurp of bubbling stew, the faint drip-drip as condensation slides down ropes like rain in miniature. Your nostrils warm with savoury air, your stomach growls so loudly you wonder if the tent heard. Outside the wind still sings, but here the orchestra is liquid and fragrant. Another mainstream fact cooking inside the tent wasn't just for eating, it was psychological survival. A hot meal convinced hunters that the night was theirs, not the frost's. Food was story time, fuel, song, fuel, laughter fuel. Even a thin porridge became a declaration. We're not only alive, we're comfortable enough to be picky. In some camps, meals doubled as humidity control. Steam softened hides, soothed throats, and made mornings less brittle. The science is there, but the experience is stronger. The smell of broth is winter's bedtime hymn. A fringe tidbit, some sources describe sprinkling herbs, juniper needles or dried berries into the fire itself, not for flavour, but for fragrance and ritual. The smoke was said to chase away evil spirits or simply bad moods. In other traditions, hunters dropped a pebble of salt into the stew and joked that it was the voice of the sea carrying luck from summer into winter. And there are scattered notes of people deliberately letting pots simmer long into the night, so that the warm smell itself lulled them to sleep, a sensory guard dog against despair. Modern aside, today we worry about carbon monoxide alarms and safety labels, but the principle hasn't changed. Campers still huddle around small stoves, cook inside vestibules, and invent clever ways to vent steam. Hunters had no titanium pots or lightweight burners, they had ingenuity, patience, and a tolerance for eating ash-flavoured stew. You joke as you stir. Tonight's special stew a la canvas seasoned with smoke hole. Another Michelin star dining if the inspector likes pine and despair. The dog adds his own commentary by sneezing dramatically at the steam, as though he's a critic unimpressed by portion size. The pot bubbles low, you scoop broth into a wooden cup, sip slowly. Heat slides down your throat, spreads into your belly, then out to your hands and toes the same way the hot stone did earlier, but more generous. Each swallow is not just food, it's an extension of fire smuggled inside your own body. You exhale steam mingling with steam, and the tent feels larger, warmer, safer, and yet as your cup empties you notice the ceiling clouding smoke pooling where it shouldn't. The flap shifts not enough. You cough once, twice, and remember the next hunter's trick, controlling not the stew but the drafts that rule the fire. But the next duty was even stranger. Survival meant mastering the invisible smoke holes and drafts, the delicate dance of air that kept warmth in and suffocation out. You wipe your eyes, coughing once, then glance upward where the roof of your little winter house hangs low with smoke. The stew was a success, the warmth a triumph. But now you've inherited the ancient puzzle how to invite fire's heat while evicting its gossip. Hunters across centuries learned that living with a flame indoors was not only about tending coals, it was about choreographing air. You couldn't see drafts, but you could feel them, smell them sometimes, even hear them like whispers moving through cloth. The mainstream fact smoke holes and draft management were as vital as the fire itself in winter tents. In teepees, a pair of adjustable flaps acted like eyelids raised or lowered depending on wind direction, so smoke climbed and then slipped away. Sami Lavu shelters had a crown opening at the top controlled with poles and ropes. Some Siberian chums left an intentional seam gap at the peak, adjusting it with hides as the wind shifted. The goal was simple, but finicky: create a gentle upward pull that ferried smoke out while dragging fresh air in low. Without this choreography, hunters suffocated in warmth, rather than cold, a less obvious but equally final danger. A quirky tidbit drifts in like a lazy plume. Some diaries mention hanging a feather or a strip of moss near the hearth as a smoke indicator. If it danced too wildly, the vent was wrong. If it hung limp in thick air, also wrong. Hunters needed a lazy sway that meant balance. In parts of the Arctic, children were taught to watch how the smoke curled near the ceiling. When it coiled into a spiral, it was time to tweak the flap. And one 19th century trapper bragged about training his dog as a smoke alarm. If the animal started sneezing and scratching at the door, someone had to adjust the vent. Not exactly OSHA approved, but effective. Historians still argue whether indoor fires were constant or intermittent. Some scholars suggest that in mobile hunting tents, fires were lit mostly for cooking, then banked low or extinguished overnight with vents closed tight to conserve heat. Others insist ethnographic reports show families keeping embers alive all night, venting carefully, and using smoke itself as a tool to dry hides, to chase insects, even to add a protective layer of soot to tent interiors. Archaeologists point to smoke-blackened poles in surviving artifacts as evidence that fires burned regularly inside. The debate lingers, fueled by the fact that every camp made its own bargain with weather resources and risk. You lean toward the flap, now fumbling with the stick that props it. The wind outside hisses like 1,000 whispers, tugging one way then another. You adjust the flap toward the lee side, allowing smoke to escape without inviting snow back in. Immediately the ceiling clears a little, the plume shifts, and the stew pot stops weeping onto your forehead. The difference is instant, like cracking a window in a steamy kitchen. Fresh air threads along the floor, fire perks up your lungs unclench. The sensory anchors tell the story. The flutter of canvas as the flap adjusts. The sigh of the fire as it gets the oxygen it craved. The soft swirl of smoke leaving instead of lingering. Even the smell changes, less acrid, more woody, almost sweet. You inhale, and for the first time since the stew boiled, your chest says, yes, we can live with this. Another mainstream detail vents weren't just about smoke, they were about temperature regulation. Close too tight and condensation built on the walls, freezing into rime that fell like icy dandruff when disturbed. Leave too wide and drafts crept in, undoing all the boughs and blankets. Skilled hunters checked vents, constantly nudging flaps with sticks, adding snow here, removing it there. It was less set and forget than set, sigh, repeat. A fringe practice peeks through the haze. In some camps, people hung a second skin, a thin hide or cloth about halfway up the tent, creating a false ceiling that forced smoke to funnel out more efficiently. Others used stones placed just inside the vent hole to keep snow from collapsing. It shut a quiet guard against blizzards. A few even experimented with angled vents, extra seams cut deliberately off-center, so smoke took a diagonal path upward. Whether genius or superstition, the fact remains some of these tweaks worked, or at least kept people occupied while snow buried the sleds. Modern aside, it's not so different from adjusting the bathroom fan or cracking the car window just enough to stop it fogging. Humans have always been in conversation with air currents. Winter tents simply make the conversation urgent. Drafts are roommates, not servants. You negotiate with them or you lose the lease. You joke because survival loves comedy. If smoke's the fourth roommate, at least it doesn't steal my socks. Another line. This is the original smart home ventilation system, runs on sticks and complaints. And leaning back into the warmth as the air clears, I'll charge rent if smoke keeps hanging around. The dog sneezes once as if to confirm you've done your job. You smile, relieved. Inside the balance feels right now, heat rising, fresh air, sliding, smoke leaving politely. You've bent invisible forces into a truce. The stew rests on the coals, the stones glow, the tent breathes. But the next duty was even stranger. Food and warmth weren't only about fire, they depended on the most inconvenient element of all, water. And in the deep freeze, hunters had to learn how to turn snow, ice and frost into drinkable life without losing precious heat. You tip the cup back, letting the last bit of broth slide down, and the warmth drapes itself across your chest like a loyal blanket. But hunger is only half the bargain. The other half is thirst, and thirst is crueler in winter than in summer. Out here, water surrounds you in infinite forms. Snow, ice, frost drifts piled higher than your tent, but it's all locked away, frozen and stubborn. Hunters knew the joke in winter. You could die of thirst while drowning in snow. Tonight you join the oldest chore of cold weather life, making drinkable water out of the very substance that chills you. The mainstream fact is blunt melting snow for water is essential but dangerous if done wrong. Eat snow straight and you cool your body core, risk hypothermia, and force your metabolism to waste calories warming the ice. Melt it carelessly, and you scorch the pot, evaporate away half the yield, or worse, burn fuel that you'll desperately need later. The universal rule across Arctic hunters' frontier: trappers and mountain herders melt slowly, always with a starter of liquid water or fat at the bottom of the pot and feed snow into it gradually. Never trust a dry pot full of snow became wisdom carved as deep as any rune. A quirky tidbit frosts the rim of memory. Some northern hunters carried a tiny pouch of ice chips from a stream or pond tucked into their coat. At camp, they dropped this into the pot first to teach the snow to melt. It sounds like superstition, but it was really a trick of physics. A little liquid water prevents scalding and produces smoother melt. Other diaries describe stirring snow with a stick to aerate it, preventing clumping. And there's the culinary twist: hunters often flavoured melted snow with spruce tips, pine needles, or even more exciting, burnt marrow bones dropped in like bouillon cubes. Suddenly survival water became pine tea or broth, adding morale to hydration. Historians still argue whether hunters preferred snow or ice as their source. Snow is abundant but airy. You need a kettle of snow for a sip of water. Ice denser yields more liquid but takes more effort to break free and transport. Some ethnographic accounts note that Inuit preferred river ice when available, while Siberian herders hacked lake ice blocks to stack like treasure outside tents. Frontier trappers often dug through drifts to find old compact snow, which melted more efficiently than fluffy surface powder. The scholarly debate circles the same campfire convenience versus efficiency. Most hunters probably used both snow for immediacy, ice for storage. You crouch by the fire and set the pot back on its stone perch. With a mitten, you scoop a handful of snow-dry squeaky powder that almost skates across the fabric and drop it into the pot. Nothing happens. The snow sulks, refusing to melt. You wait, then watch as the bottom blackens slightly, giving off that strange burnt smell that's half steam, half complaint. A rookie mistake: you've forgotten the starter. You splash the dregs of broth into the bottom, then add more snow slowly, handful by reluctant handful. This time the snow size collapses and turns liquid. You stir with a stick, watching the volume grow. The sensory anchors shift into a watery register. The slurp-slurp of melting snow. The faint hiss when a wet patch kisses hot stone. The plink as droplets of condensation fall from the smoke flap, little frozen tears surrendering to gravity. Your mouth already feels less like parchment, more like possibility. Outside, the wind still chants, but you ignore it. Your attention is on the alchemy in the pot. Another mainstream fact: hydration in winter isn't only about liquid, it's about timing. Hunters drank at night to recharge, but also rationed carefully at dawn, knowing that moving through deep snow drained more water than sweat revealed. Dehydration crept quietly, disguised by cold. Some guides warned that a parched mouth is already too late. That's why melting snow was not just a bedtime routine, but an all-day project. Keeping embers alive meant water on demand, even when the sun barely rose. A fringe tidbit drifts in like steam. Some cultures added a spoon of animal fat to melted snow, not just for calories, but to slow refreezing. Fat floated in slick constellations, and while modern palates may wince, hunters swore it coated the throat and kept the belly warm. Others poured melted snow into skin bags worn under coats so body heat kept it liquid overnight. And in the Andes, herders left blackened pots filled with snow in the sun by day. The dark metal drank heat, turning snow to water without burning fuel. Ingenious boredom at work. Modern aside, we still teach campers to prime the pot with water, stir gently, and avoid eating snow raw. Portable stoves and insulated bottles make it easier, but the ritual hasn't changed much. You're doing what humans have always done, converting cold into comfort with patience and a bit of fire. You sip from the cup, now the liquid still tasting faintly of broth, slightly smoky, faintly piney. Your throat warms your body, thanks you, and your eyelids surrender another ounce of vigilance. The dog noses the pot, lapping a small share, his tail thumping approval. For a moment the tent feels like an inn, the storm like a rumour, the cold like a neighbour you've outwitted, and you laugh softly, snow-served hot. Another joke, 5-star restaurant watercourse chef's special melted January. And the last muttered with drowsy pride. It's not hydration, it's negotiation with ice. You set the pot aside, bank the coals again, slide under the fur. The world has stopped stealing from you, at least for now. Yet even with food and water solved, one more ingredient was essential. Not calories, not fuel, but morale. Hunters sang and told stories, turning the darkness into a kind of warmth no fire could give. But the next duty was even stranger when the cold-pressed hardest voices rose softer songs, and stories by firelight, the warmth of sound, carrying farther than blankets ever could. He pot cools beside the hearth the dog has curled back into his comma of fur, and you lie there half awake, half fed, wondering how anyone managed to live through winters this long without losing their minds. That's when you remember the other fire, the one not made of coals or wood, but of words. Hunters in frozen seasons didn't just feed their bodies, they fed their spirits with songs and stories. The sound of a voice your own, a companion's, a grandmother's remembered tale was as important as a stone, a bough bed or a hot stew. When the wind shook the canvas like a drum, voices steadied the rhythm. The mainstream fact across culture's winter camps were filled with oral traditions. Sami families told Joik chants, melodic lines tied to reindeer mountains or memories half song and half prayer. Inuit hunters shared myths of Sedna, the sea, mother tales that explained why storms raged and why seals appeared. North American plains hunters swapped trickster stories, coyote or raven or old man, reminding everyone that cleverness beats cold as often as firewood does. Even medieval European hunters stuck in makeshift lodges recited saints' lives or animal fables, voices rising above creaking beams. Storytelling was survival. It kept children, still adults, sane, and everyone distracted from the arithmetic of hunger. A quirky tidbit hums through the smoke. Some trappers kept story sticks carved with notches for each tale told that season. Each evening a notch, a memory, a ritual against despair. Among Sami, the joik wasn't always sung aloud. It could be hummed quietly into fur while drifting to sleep, a song so personal that hearing it felt like stepping into someone else's skin. On the frontier, hunters sometimes performed coffee songs, half tunes, half complaints about the bitterness of camp brew. Diaries preserve odd refrains, boil it black, drink it twice, curse it thrice. Humour disguised as music. Historians still argue about whether winter oral traditions served more as entertainment or education. Some insist these nights were the main schoolroom of preliterate cultures, where children learned geography, ethics, animal behaviour and kinship. Others emphasise the therapeutic function, voices weaving community in the middle of an isolating season. Archaeologists note the difficulty stories leave no bones, no artefacts, only the memory of rhythm in living mouths. But when you line up the ethnographies, a pattern emerges. Winter was always the season of words, because words weigh less than firewood, but burn just as bright. You clear your throat, feel the dry air, scratch a little, then hum a line. It's clumsy low, but the dog perks his ears anyway. You speak to the empty space, telling a half-remembered hunting tale, something about a fox that outsmarted a trapper, something about boots that froze so solid they walked away alone. You're not eloquent, but you don't need to be. The sound itself, warm and steady, fills the hollow corners of the tent. The canvas seems to listen, the poles seem to nod, even the coals brighten as if curious. The sensory anchors are all sound now, the crackle of a branch giving up its last ember. The hush-hush of wind through the flaps suddenly less hostile when paired with your voice. The deep breath of the dog as he sighs back into slumber unconcerned because you are speaking. Even your own words echo faintly in the canvas dome, softer than stone, rounder than snow. The tent has become an instrument, and your story is its music. Another mainstream fact, laughter itself kept hunters warm. When blood rushed to cheeks, when shoulders shook, when bellies tightened, the body generated real heat. More importantly, laughter pulled focus away from pain. Journals from soldiers and trappers alike mention jokes as rations shared nightly, sometimes repeated endlessly, because repetition itself became funny. If you can laugh at frost, frost loses a little of its bite. A fringe tidbit in some traditions, stories were used as timers. A long tale marked the time until the stew was ready. A short trickster yarn filled the minutes needed to boil snow water. In Greenland, some families told a story whose length corresponded to the time it took an oil lamp to warm a sealskin mitten hung above it. Precision disguised as myth. In Japan's snowy villages, folk tales were stretched into longer, slower cadences during winter evening snow stories because long nights demanded long words. Storytelling adapted itself to the season like clothing did. Modern aside, we still do this. Podcasts, audiobooks, late-night YouTube rambles, voices in the dark that trick the brain into letting go of tension. You might call it entertainment, but your body calls it warmth. If your eyelids droop while someone else speaks, you've borrowed one of the oldest technologies' bedtime narrative as thermal regulation. You chuckle at your own thought. So this is the original Netflix Flames and Folklore no subscription required. Another joke. If I fall asleep mid-story, consider it a 5-star review. And finally murmured to the dog, "Don't worry, in my version the clever fox always shares the leftovers. His tail thumps once, which you take as applause. The story trails off into nothing, but the silence feels fuller now, as though it contains echoes of laughter and song." Outside, the wind sulks less triumphant. Inside, your body is calmer, warmer, more convinced that dawn is possible. Stories can't melt snow or split wood, but they melt fear and split loneliness, which may be the more important chores. But the next duty was even stranger words soothed the night. But chores never ended. Even in sleep, hunters had to wake, stoke coals, shift blankets, check dogs, so you drift toward half rest, half duty, the strange rhythm of night watches in a frozen camp. You drift somewhere between dream and duty, eyelids tugging shut while the fire ticks away. But even in sleep, the night has an agenda. Hunters in winter camps never surrendered completely. Someone always kept a fraction of their mind awake, listening for the cough of the fire, the sigh of the dogs, the whisper of wind sneaking in through a seam. This wasn't paranoia, it was scheduling. Winter nights demanded rotations of wakefulness, a rhythm of chores and vigilance that became as much tradition as necessity. The mainstream fact seasonal hunting rhythms dictated how nights were divided. In family camps, watch duties rotated, one adult rising to check embers stir the stew pot, or tighten a flap, then curling back under the hides while another stirred. Among soldiers on campaign fireguard was a formal duty every couple of hours. Someone trudged from cot to cot, feeding coals, shaking frost from blankets, making sure no one froze silently. In frontier trappers' journals, you read of men sleeping in 2 or 3 hour chunks, rising between to mend gear or pace the camp for warmth. Hunters knew that winter didn't sleep, so neither could they not completely. A quirky tidbit yawns awake some groups used time markers instead of clocks. A story's length measured 1 watch. A candle stub burning down an inch marked another. Sami herders sometimes gauged the shift by how far the northern lights had travelled across the sky a living hour hand. And in medieval Europe, night watches were literally tied to church bells, though out in the deep forest hunters substituted with belly bells. When hunger woke you, it was time to feed both fire and self. Diaries mention half-wakes, where someone would roll over, poke the coals with a stick still in hand, then fall back asleep without really opening their eyes. Survival by muscle memory. Historians still argue about whether these rotations were disciplined or improvised. Some insist camps had clear rules. Eldest took first watch, strongest handled coldest hours, children exempt until older. Others suggest it was messier. Whoever couldn't sleep became default firekeeper. Archaeological evidence is scarce, but soot layers and burnt patches in tent circles suggest many fires were indeed tended throughout the night. Scholars debate whether humans naturally sleep in segments, the old theory of first sleep and second sleep, and whether winter camps made that pattern more visible. The consensus is boring, but practical hunters slept when they could, woke when they must, and always kept the fire breathing. You roll over, no eyes half open, and prod the coals with a stick. A few sparks leap up dancing like mischievous stars before fading. You add a twig, a finger-sized branch, nothing dramatic, just enough to keep the ember bed honest. The dog watches with one cracked eyelid, tail twitching, once then goes back to chasing imaginary rabbits in his sleep. You smile, he trusts you, which means you're doing your job. The sensory anchors are subdued in this liminal hour. The whisper of ash when you stir it, the tiny ping of ice forming outside as trees exhale, the slow breath of your partner under the hide, steady as the tide. Even the wind seems quieter, as if it too has grown drowsy. Night watch isn't about drama. It's about acknowledging that the world never stops moving and neither can you. Another mainstream fact night chores often included gear checks. Hunters hung damp socks or mittens near the coals, then flipped them during watch. Knives and axes were leaned near enough to stay thawed, but not so close they warped. Sled harnesses if damp were draped so frost didn't steal them by morning. Forget one item, and tomorrow punished you. That's why watches mattered not only to stoke the fire, but to keep the small economy of camp turning over. A fringe tidbit in some communities watch shifts included ritual murmurs, short prayers, songs, or even counting games whispered to embers. A Sami joiker might hum a tune for the reindeer while shifting logs. A Russian trapper might mutter proverbs about frost. Plains hunters sometimes told half-jokes to themselves, claiming laughter kept the wood lively. There's also the curious note from 18th century military camps, where soldiers were ordered to walk the circle of tents once per shift, both for safety and to stamp their feet enough to keep toes. The fire kept you warm, the walking kept you whole. Modern aside, if you've ever set a midnight alarm just to check your thermostat or kept your phone flashlight ready for a power outage, you've echoed the same rhythm. Sleep, wake, tend, sleep again. Civilization may feel continuous, but survival often pulses in intervals. You chuckle softly, whispering, "Congratulations, insomnia, you've been promoted to camp duty." Another joke. They call this the graveyard shift, but at least I'm literally keeping us out of it. And one more muttered into the coals, "If fire had a union, I'd be its overworked intern." You lie back, tugging the hide over your shoulders again, comforted by the quiet labour of night. You've done just enough, not too much, not too little. The fire sighs, the tent breathes, the cold grumbles but stays outside. Night watch is not heroism. It's repetition, small acts that add up to dawn. But the next duty was even stranger: firewood runs out blankets where thin, and sometimes the only way to keep heat alive until sunrise was to carry embers from one camp to another, treating coals like treasure tucked carefully for tomorrow. You dream of warmth even as your body half wakes to the crackle of the fire turning shy again. The pile of sticks you gathered earlier is thinning, the bigger logs already tucked into the coals. In deep winter, fuel is never just wood, it's time, labour and insurance. You remember what the elders in every hunting culture knew. Sometimes the smartest survival wasn't building a new fire each morning, but carrying yesterday's flame forward like a secret you refused to lose. The mainstream fact hunters, herders and travellers across frozen lands often carried embers from one camp to the next, preserving fire overnight or across miles. It saved time, energy and precious tinder. Plains peoples used buffalo horn or metal boxes to cradle glowing coals under ash. Sami herders sometimes banked embers in birch bark bundles insulated with moss smouldering gently until dawn. Siberian hunters carried little clay or iron pots packed with coals and covered with snow to keep oxygen low but steady. The practice was so common that in some languages the word for fire and life were almost interchangeable. If you carried flame, you carried continuity. A quirky tidbit glows like a coal under moss. Some trappers in North America stuffed hot embers into a hollowed-out fungus tinder conch, which smouldered for hours without going out. Others tucked coals into moose dung, yes, really wrapped in hide. It smelled questionable, but worked brilliantly holding heat until morning. Among Polynesian voyagers in very different climates, but with the same principle, embers were sealed inside gourds with ash, carried across seas to ignite new island hearths. Fire is universal, and so are the tricks to keep it alive. Historians still argue about how far embers could realistically be carried. Some sources claim coals smouldered all day in carefully packed containers relit easily at night. Skeptics say the accounts are romantic exaggerations. In reality, many fires died and were simply restarted with flint steel or friction. Archaeologists occasionally find soot-stained boxes or horn containers in graves, suggesting fire transport was important enough to be buried with. Scholars debate whether these were symbolic or practical, but anyone who has tried lighting fire in a blizzard knows symbolism only goes so far. You crouch now and perform the ancient ritual yourself. With a stick you rake glowing coals into a pile, then sprinkle fine ash over them until they resemble a dessert red centre grey crust. Too much ash and they choke, too little and they flare and die. You take a small birch bark cone, fold its edges, spoon 2 embers inside and tuck dry moss over the top. It's warm against your glove, radiating promise. You slide the bundle into a clay cup set near the tent wall. If the fire goes stubborn in the night, you'll still have a heartbeat waiting in its cocoon. The sensory anchors change timbre. The scratch of your stick stirring coals, the soft hiss of moss settling onto heat, the faint throb of warmth against your palm. Even your ears catch a new sound, not crackle, not blaze, but a low pulse like the earth itself, exhaling through ash. Outside wind claws at the snow wall, but inside you've bottled a sun fragment, tucked it into a pocket. Another mainstream point ember carrying wasn't only for continuity, it was a safeguard. Hunters often kept 2 bundles, one inside the shelter, one buried in snow outside. If the tent caught fire or collapsed, the second ember saved the day. Accounts mention travellers digging into snowdrifts at dawn, pulling out a bundle still glowing and relighting camp as if nothing had happened. To them, fire wasn't a luxury but a covenant. Losing it meant not just inconvenience, but exposure, hunger, and risk. A fringe tidbit, some traditions wrapped embers in animal fat before bundling, slowing oxygen flow and adding fuel. Others smeared resin around the inside of a container to waterproof and insulate it. There are even mentions of hunters singing small chants while tucking embers away, half practical timing, the ritual carefully, half psychological. Fire likes attention. In Norse sagas, fire itself is personified the good guest who must be carried and fed. Whether poetry or practice, the idea remains flame is family. Modern aside, we still do this in gentler ways. Campers bank coals under ash. Overnight hikers use insulated stoves to carry heat from meal to meal, and survivalists test carrying embers in punkwood or charcloth. Matches and lighters trick us into forgetting, but the instinct is the same. Don't waste energy. Carry continuity. You grin, tucking the ember bundle more securely. Congratulations, you're the VIP of this campsite, you murmur to it. Another joke. My carry-on luggage is literally glowing, and one more whispered to the dog who stirs curious, "Relax, you're still the warmest heater, but the stone gets overtime." Back under the hides, you feel strangely reassured. Even if the coals in the hearth sigh their last, you have a secret ember banked, humming quietly, patient as dawn. The thought eases your breathing, stretches your spine, softens your jaw. Fire will be there tomorrow because you carried it forward tonight. But the next duty was even stranger. Heat and flame weren't enough. Hunters also faced the slow, gnawing danger of frostbite and frozen breath, and their tricks for protecting noses, fingers and lungs reveal ingenuity both practical and absurd. You wake with a start, not from noise but from the peculiar ache that creeps into fingers when the night leans colder than expected. Your hands tingle as if ants are marching, your nose feels like it belongs to someone else, and when you exhale, your breath hangs in the tent like a ghost reluctant to leave. Fire blankets and dogs can only do so much. Winter is a thief that favours extremities first. Hunters knew this all too well, and so they developed an arsenal of tricks, serious, silly, ingenious to keep fingers gripping tools. Noses attached to faces and lungs from turning brittle in the frost. The mainstream fact frostbite prevention was constant business for hunters in cold tents. Fingers and toes were wrapped in layers of wool or fur, sometimes with grass or moss, stuffed between socks as insulation. Noses were shielded with scarves, felt masks or even little leather flaps tied around the face called nose guards in some Arctic traditions. Breathing itself was managed carefully through cloth that warmed and humidified the air, preventing lungs from burning with each icy gasp. Across the north, the principle was universal. Keep air warm before it enters, keep skin covered before frost claims it, keep blood flowing, with small movements before numbness settles in. A quirky tidbit wiggles its frostbitten toes. Frontier hunters sometimes rubbed their hands and faces with animal fat or grease, swearing it created a barrier against wind. Imagine smearing bacon drippings on your cheeks before bed. It smelled, but it worked, reducing evaporation and windburn. In parts of Siberia, the hunters stitched tiny fur pouches that they slipped over noses and ears at night, joking that they looked like foxes pretending to sleep. And in diaries from the Rockies, trappers described sleeping with mittens still on, then tying them loosely with rawhide so they wouldn't slip off during tossing and turning. Nothing says luxury sweet like waking up with a mitten print across your cheek. Historians still argue about how widespread these nose guards and grease practices really were. Some suggest they were last resort solutions noted by curious outsiders rather than everyday tools. Others counter that frostbite scars in skeletal remains, shortened toes, missing nasal cartilage prove how often people lost the fight. Archaeologists find few direct artifacts because grease vanishes. Cloth rots and cartilage doesn't fossilize well. Still, the pattern is clear ingenuity kept many hunters alive, but winter always won a few battles. You flex your fingers now, rubbing them against each other and feel the sting recede. You slide mittens back on, tightening them at the wrist so no draft sneaks in. You adjust the scarf across your nose, catching your own breath in its fibres. The first exhale feels damp, the second feels warm, the third feels like your lungs are sighing in relief. Your toes still cold. You shift them, curling, uncurling until blood rushes back with a vengeance. Painful, yes, but pain is proof of ownership. The sensory anchors sharpen in this chore. The crack of icy fabric as you move, the rasp of wool over your nose catching moisture, the thump of blood returning to fingers echoing in your ears. Outside, the snow groans faintly under its own weight, as though the earth sympathizes with your joints. Even the dog twitches in his sleep paws, fluttering against Frost's invisible argument. Another mainstream point movement was medicine. Hunters rose in the night to stamp feet, swing arms, and shake shoulders, not out of energy but obligation. Blood that stagnates becomes Frost's first victim. Some practice shadow work, pretending to chop wood or paddle a canoe inside the tent, absurd motions that looked like dancing but bought them another hour of circulation. A Sami elder once said, "If you cannot sleep, at least let your blood sleepwalk." A fringe tidbit grins at the absurd in some Siberian traditions. People chewed or held small wooden sticks between their teeth, while sleeping in tents, the idea being that clenching promoted jaw warmth, and reminded the body to keep blood flowing to the face. Other notes describe tying rabbit fur around toes with twine, the softness supposedly tricking Frost into ignoring them. In Greenland, families sometimes hung dried fish skins near the fire, and used them as emergency mittens, crunchy, smelly, but surprisingly warm once softened. Did it work? Yes, though your dignity might not survive. Modern aside, we've upgraded to hand warmers, neoprene masks, and breathable fabrics, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Cover, insulate, keep air moist, and keep moving. Your ancestors had bacon grease and rabbit fur. You have chemical packets and fleece. The goal remains identical, trick Frost into finding someone else. You laugh under your scarf. Great, my survival kit is a dog, a rock, and a greasy face. Another joke. If anyone invents mitten insurance, I'll buy the premium plan. And one whispered through your nose guard, "Take that, Frost, you'll have to pry these toes from my cold, sweaty socks." The dog shifts closer, pressing warmth into your calves. You feel the scarf grow damp but soothing with every breath. Your fingers no longer ache, your nose has a heartbeat again, your toes sulk but obey. You've passed the night's cruelest test not by conquering Frost but by out-negotiating it with layers, grease and grit. But the next duty was even stranger. Warmth didn't just come from gear or fires, it came from what you ate. Hunters learned that stuffing themselves with fat-rich food at night was as important as blankets, and the peculiar diets of frozen camps reveal why calories were heaters disguised as supper. Your scarf is damp with breath, your fingers flex in their mittens, and the dog has resumed his steady snore. But just as frostbite prowls from the outside, hunger prowls from within. You remember the lesson repeated across cultures. Centuries, continents, you are your own furnace. The calories you burn are the fuel that keeps your body from surrendering. Out here, no matter how many hides you pile or how tall your snow wall stands if you go to bed empty, the cold will finish the argument for you. The mainstream fact, winter hunters and travellers relied heavily on fat-rich diets to survive frozen nights. Fat burns slow, steady and hot, feeding the body longer than lean meat or quick starch. Inuit hunters treasured seal blubber and whale, fat-eating chunks raw or melting them into broth. Siberian hunters carried dried fish smeared with fat or slabs of bear meat salted and smoked until it dripped. On the North American frontier, trappers swore by pemmican, dried bison meat pounded with fat and berries packed dense into blocks that could last months. Medieval Europeans on hunts roasted pork belly and carried butter by the fistful. Calories weren't flavour, they were body heat disguised as food. A quirky tidbit chews its way in some Sami herders, and hunters practiced the ritual of fat tea, pouring melted reindeer fat into warm broth, or even directly into a cup of boiled snow water. It looked like floating candle wax, but it slid down the throat with an oily warmth that lingered for hours. Frontier hunters joked that pemmican wasn't food, but heat in your pocket, a meal so dense you could feel it stoking you from the inside out. and in diaries from Russian expeditions, men describe eating butter by the slice as casually as bread, so much butter that one officer muttered it was the wax that keeps men from burning out. Historians still argue about whether protein poisoning, sometimes called rabbit starvation, really plagued hunters who lacked fat. Some accounts describe men eating endless lean meat and still starving bodies wasting because protein alone couldn't sustain. Others insist this was overstated by later writers. Archaeological evidence of bone marrow extraction and widespread use of fat in cooking strongly suggests hunters knew the truth instinctively fat was essential. Without it, no tent or blanket was enough. With it, even bitter nights became survivable. You set your pot back on the stones, dropping in a last scrap of dried meat and a curl of fat from your pouch. It melts, slicking the surface like golden glass. The smell is rich, primal, satisfying. You sip once, twice, and feel the slow burns settle into your belly. It spreads outward, not fast like hot stones, not sharp like firelight, but steady, like a coal bed inside your own chest. Your toes ease your shoulders, unclench. You are for this moment your own hearth. The sensory anchors turn inward, the gurgle of stew bubbling, the slurp of fat breaking into rivulets, the hum of your stomach waking like a content furnace. Outside, the wind still rattles branches, but inside the loudest sound is digestion, a small orchestra of survival. Even your breath feels thicker, warmer, like the air itself has been reheated on the way out. Another mainstream point: many hunters timed heavy meals for night rather than day. Day required agility. Too much fat made you sluggish. But night welcomed it. Your body burned slow fuel in stillness, stretching warmth through hours of rest. Families often saved the richest foods, fatty cuts, marrow butter, for the evening meal precisely because sleep was dangerous if the furnace ran empty. Calories were not just nourishment, they were a sleeping strategy. A fringe tidbit waddles in with greasy fingers. In some camps, hunters ate candle wax in emergencies. Made of tallow or beeswax, it was technically edible, and diaries mention desperate men gnawing candles to stave off the cold. Others mention drinking melted marrow from bones, treating it like soup, rich enough to make lips shine for hours. And in 19th century polar expeditions, sailors sometimes mixed powdered chocolate with fat, inventing a primitive energy bar that modern hikers would recognize instantly. History as usual was practical before it was gourmet. Modern aside, your protein bars, trail mix and peanut butter packets are heirs to this same tradition. Calories per gram mattered then as now. Fat is 9 calories per gram protein, and carbs only 4. Hunters didn't have spreadsheets, but they had instincts, and those instincts said eat the greasy part or freeze politely. You grin into your cup. Bon appetit me. Dinner à la frost. Another joke. This stew is so oily it should pay rent. And one more whispered to the dog, licking his lips. Fine, you can have the next bite, but you're paying me back in heat. His tail thumps a rhythm of agreement. You finish the last spoonful, lean back, and feel warmth stretch through you like a long yawn. The cold still presses at the walls, but inside you've built a double fire, one in the hearth, one in your gut. For the first time tonight, you don't just hope for dawn, you feel certain you'll see it. But the next duty was even stranger: food, and fat gave warmth. But hunters also relied on rituals and charms, small odd beliefs that convinced them frost could be bargained with, and that faith itself might tip the balance towards survival. You sit back with your belly full, warmth spreading slow and steady, but you know every hunter understood this truth. Physics will take you far, calories farther. Yet sometimes it wasn't enough. There were nights when fire-sulked stones cooled too soon, dogs huddled but still shivered, and frost whispered louder than laughter. On those nights, hunters reached for something harder to measure ritual's charms and superstition. Not because magic literally burned hotter than wood, but because belief filled cracks that no blanket could patch. The mainstream fact in winter camps across the world, people leaned on rituals before sleep. Sami herders murmured joiks to reindeer spirits, asking them to guard the herd and the sleepers. Inuit families sometimes offered scraps of meat to the fire, appeasing Sedna or other spirits, so the night would pass without storms. In Siberia, Evenki hunters traced small circles in ash around their beds, believing frost demons disliked boundaries. European trappers crossed themselves, muttered prayers to St. Hubert Petronsent of hunters, or recited psalms against the chill. Ritual wasn't superstition to them. It was another layer of insulation, this one wrapped around the mind. A quirky tidbit flickers like a candle: some Russian trappers carried iron keys in their pockets at night, believing iron repelled spirits that prowled during the coldest hours. In the Carpathians, hunters sprinkled salt around tent entrances, joking that even frost must season its meat. Among Sami, children were sometimes told to tuck a sprig of juniper under their pillow for warmth, a fragrant little guardian against icy dreams. And a few frontier journals mention men who slept with their gunpowder horn close, muttering it kept away night spirits. Practical, yes, if not magical, at least you could light a fire faster. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuine belief or simply comfort theatre. Some anthropologists insist charms were as central to survival as blankets, because fear itself drains warmth. Others think most of these stories were exaggerated later by romantic writers. Archaeological evidence is elusive, salt dissolves. Juniper rots, whispered prayers don't fossilise. Still, when you gather enough fragments from oral histories and field notes, you see the same pattern. Rituals created psychological resilience, and resilience is its own kind of heat. You mimic the old practices yourself. With the tip of a stick, you draw a small circle in the ash around your bough bed. It looks like nothing yet, the gesture feels like a handshake with the night. You rub a scrap of pine resin between your fingers and toss it onto the coals, the flame flares releasing a sharp green smell that curls into the canvas roof. The dog lifts his head, sniffs and settles again as if reassured. You tug the blanket higher, whispering to no one in particular, let the frost find someone else. The sensory anchors take on a softer edge, the crackle of resin on coals spitting tiny sparks, the curl of smoke rising in delicate threads less choking than earlier, almost sweet. The faint jingle of the dog's collar as he resettles a bell marking the rhythm of belief. Outside the wind knocks, but now it sounds less like claws, more like a tired visitor. Another mainstream fact rituals often doubled as memory keepers. Stories about spirits were also stories about safe practices. Don't whistle at night or spirits come often meant save your breath in the cold. Leave food for the fire spirit meant don't let the fire go hungry. Even the most mystical customs carried practical wisdom hidden under myth. A fringe tidbit, some accounts describe dream tasks. Hunters would speak aloud what they hoped to dream finding game, a successful hunt a safe return believing the dream would guide tomorrow. Others left a small knife unbuckled point inward near their bedroll saying it discouraged spirits from entering. And in Lapland there are faint notes about women marking children's cheeks with ash smudges before sleep, so frost spirits would mistake them for already touched and leave them alone. Whether true or not, the image lingers survival as camouflage. Modern aside, we may no longer mutter about frost demons, but how many of us still sleep better after checking the lock, arranging the blanket just so, or leaving a lamp on low ritual even now tricks the nervous system into letting go? Superstition, psychology, habit, whatever the label, it lets the body finally unclench and the mind stop pacing. You chuckle at yourself. Great, I'm drawing doodles in ash and calling it strategy. Another joke, if salt scares away frost, I'll sleep inside a pretzel next time. And a third whispered with a grin. Imagine explaining to future historians why my nose survived juniper under the pillow. The fire softens, the circle of ash glows faintly, the resin's scent lingers in the fur. You feel your body exhale, not just from warmth, but from belief that you've done all you can, belief that the night might respect the gesture. But the next duty was even stranger, while rituals comforted scholars now pore over the evidence of tent efficiency itself, still debating what really worked best and whether hunters truly mastered the science of warmth or simply survived on a mix of trial, error and stubbornness. You lie back, the circle of ash faintly glowing like a chalk line between you and the night, and you wonder not about frost spirits this time, but about the hunters themselves. Did they truly understand the science of their tents, or did they simply stumble forward guided by habit and luck? The more you think about it, the more you realise scholars still argue over whether these simple shelters were marvels of efficiency or just good enough until dawn. And tonight your tent becomes not just a refuge but a case study. The mainstream fact tent efficiency has been debated for generations. Tipis lavu chums, yurts lean-tos all were shaped by environment, materials and trial and error engineering. A well-built tipi with its smoke flaps angled could hold steady warmth, resist collapse and vent, safely raising the inside temperature by 20 degrees or more in sub-zero storms. Sami lavu were lighter and quicker to pitch, trading some warmth for portability. Evenki chums wider at the base created more stable heat pockets in Siberia's endless winds. Every design was a compromise, but a deliberate one. Hunters weren't just surviving, they were fine-tuning. A quirky tidbit smoulders in the debate modern reenactors who test these tents sometimes emerge baffled by how well they work. One researcher in Scandinavia camped in a lavu with only a small fire and reported the interior hit nearly 50 degrees warmer than outside, enough to strip off layers and sit comfortably. Others tested lean-tos with reflective fires and discovered the design created a kind of natural heat mirror, bouncing warmth into hides so effectively that it felt like lying under an infrared lamp. And then there are skeptics engineers with equations who scratch their heads and say, on paper, this shouldn't be so efficient only to be proven wrong by practice. Historians still argue whether hunters understood the science of insulation and convection, or whether it was all instinct. Some claim they must have known at least intuitively, since they manipulated vent size, wall angle, and snow placement so precisely. Others say the knowledge was empirical, passed down without theory. Do it this way because it works, not because warm air rises. Archaeologists point to layers of soot on poles as proof that fires burned inside, constantly evidence of long-term testing and adaptation. Ethnographers emphasize oral tradition, elders teaching younger generations exactly how high to bank a snow wall or how wide to set poles for optimal draft. Science or instinct? Both, perhaps. Survival doesn't wait for peer review. You look around your tent now with new eyes. The cone shape sheds wind. The snow wall outside interrupts gusts. The bough bed insulates from ground theft. Even the tiny smoke flap, now angled just so, is doing silent geometry with every curl of air. You're lying inside a machine made of sticks, hides, and stubbornness, low-tech, yes, but fine-tuned over centuries. The sensory anchors feel sharper with this realization. The flutter of the flap is rhythmic, not random. The glow of coals is steady, the tense skin keeping heat from rushing out too rudely. The creak of poles is the sound of stress distributed evenly. You breathe in, and for once the air inside tastes balanced, neither smoky nor raw. The tent is working, and you can hear it working the way you hear a kettle just before it sings. Another mainstream point efficiency was about community knowledge. A lone hunter could survive a night, but building tents that held families, dogs, tools, and fire required collective wisdom. That's why these designs persisted across centuries. They were tested nightly, corrected each season, improved by countless cold mornings. A tipi or lavu was not primitive architecture, but the product of generations of peer-reviewed survival, every detail shaped by necessity. A fringe tidbit. Some ethnographic notes describe warming tricks that sound eccentric until you test them. For example, placing flat stones upright around the hearth, so they absorbed heat and radiated sideways like miniature radiators. Others mention deliberately burying snow inside the tent walls, believing packed snow insulated better than bare canvas. Modern thermodynamics confirms it. Snow is an insulator. The weirdest trick, hanging wet hides. Near the fire, so that when they froze stiff, they created a second shell of protection, like adding armour of ice that paradoxically trapped heat inside. Scholars argue about whether this was clever or desperate, but the principle makes sense in its own frosty way. Modern aside engineers now study these shelters the way architects study cathedrals. They analyse airflow, measure temperature gradients, and sometimes design modern tents based on the same patterns. Backpackers test super shelters, using reflective tarps, bough beds, and fires angled like lean-tos. The conclusion is humbling. Our ancestors figured out things we're still rediscovering, using nothing but instinct, repetition, and the occasional singed eyebrow. You grin, whispering into the dim, so this is an ancient HVAC system, stick skins and sass. Another joke. If you're cold, blame your geometry, not your fire, and the last muttered as you pat the dog's head. Congrats, buddy. We're living in a portable physics lesson. You pull the hides higher, feeling the tent settle as the wind outside loses interest. The night hasn't warmed, but you have, and so has your respect for the quiet genius of people who built homes out of almost nothing. But the next duty was even stranger. Tents and food worked together, yet hunters also shaped their daily routines around the cold pacing chores, naps and hunts in rhythms that modern schedules could hardly imagine. The tent holds steady, your body finally caught in a balance between fire and blanket, but your mind wanders to the way a day was carved in winter. Hunters didn't live by neat 8-hour nights and sunny mornings. Frost rewrote the schedule. Everything bent around the cold, when to sleep, when to hunt, when to move, when to simply sit and let your breath do the only work it could. Life wasn't just about surviving a single night, but about weaving a rhythm that made dozens of nights survivable. The mainstream fact seasonal hunting rhythms often meant shortening or even skipping daytime exertion in the coldest months. In northern forests, hunters trapped more than they tracked, letting lines of snares and deadfalls do the walking while they conserved energy in camp. In Arctic traditions, men might spend entire days repairing gear indoors, venturing out only for brief checks. Frontier trappers spoke of cold camping days when they stayed close to shelters, gathering wood or tending sled dogs instead of wasting calories in long hunts. Survival wasn't continuous action, it was a cycle of pulses: exert, rest, stoke, repeat. A quirky tidbit: shuffles in some Sami families even had names for the half-day naps taken when the sun barely rose. Instead of a fixed bedtime, they drifted into 2 or 3 long sleeps broken by chores at odd hours. Frontier diaries in Canada describe trappers who joked that they were nocturnal by frost, eating their biggest meals at midnight when tents were warmest, then dozing by daylight. In some Siberian camps, hunters counted their day not by hours but by fire cycles, a stretch of time measured by how long it took a bundle of wood to burn down. Ask them when dawn was and they might shrug and say 2 bundles away. Historians still argue whether this segmented schedule was universal or just situational. Some scholars point to the old European concept of first sleep and second sleep, suggesting that in winter, humans naturally slipped into segmented rest. Others argue that hunter diaries describing broken nights are simply complaints, not customs. Archaeological evidence doesn't say much. Ashes and bones don't record sleep, but the consistency of ethnographic testimony suggests winter made everyone creative with clocks. The truth seems to be that rigid schedules bend in the face of cold. Hunters survived not by holding to neat timetables, but by syncing with weatherwood and appetite. You imagine yourself in their rhythm. First watch, wake stoke coal, sip broth. Second, rest curl back under fur, listening to wind slacken. Third chore, rise again to shake snow from hides, stamp your feet, check the dogs. Fourth stretch, trudge outside for snares, breath loud in the forest hush. No tidy hours, just cycles stitched together like beads on a string. The clock is not a circle tonight, it's a spiral of needs. The sensory anchors echo this pulse. The soft tick of coals falling in the hearth marks 1 unit of time. The steady snore of the dog is another. The whine of wind, rising then falling, signals the boundary between 2 sleep segments. You're not counting hours anymore, you're counting sounds. Another mainstream point energy management was the real calendar. Hunters rationed exertion-saving heavy work for warmer stretches of day. They might set traps near camp chop wood in the afternoon sun, and keep still during the long midnight hours when temperatures hit their worst. Food fire and chores wove together like threads in a loom, each dependent on the others. If you burned too many calories chopping wood, you risked running short on food. If you overslept, the fire died. If you overhunted, the dogs collapsed. Balance was the clock. A fringe tidbit: in some Inuit traditions, hunters sang short time songs, simple chants repeated until the task was done, like melting snow or carving ice blocks. The length of the song became the measure of the chore. Among Sami joiks sometimes functioned as timers to hum a certain phrase until boots were thawed, another until hides were smoked. Frontier journals even mention men measuring pipefuls, as in, it's a 1-pipe walk to the snares. Without mechanical clocks, time became practical, embodied, and deeply local. Modern aside, our own sleep science hints we still lean towards segmented rhythms, in winter only forced out of it by electric light and alarms. The way you scroll late at night, nap midday, or wake in the small hours, that was once simply how humans lived, especially when the nights were longer than the days. Hunters didn't think of it as strange, they thought of it as necessary. You smirk into the darkness. So my midnight snack is actually historical tradition. Another joke: forget 9 to 5, this is more like eat, sleep, chop, snow, repeat. And one whispered toward the dog, if you're on the night shift, I'll take the nap shift. His ears twitch, perhaps approving the bargain. You settle deeper into your hide, realizing that winter life wasn't just about beating cold 1 night at a time. It was about settling into a rhythm where even discomfort felt predictable, almost normal. Hunters didn't just survive winters, they scheduled them. But the next duty was even stranger. Survival schedules were one thing, but the sheer tools of daily work froze to skin. If handled carelessly, hunters had to master tricks to keep iron from biting fingers and lips, a problem colder and meaner than it sounds. The fire pops softly, sending up a stray spark that dies mid-air, and your eyes drift to the bundle of tools resting against the tent wall. Your knife, the axe, a small saw, even the tin cup you used earlier. They all sit there looking innocent, But every hunter knew the truth in deep winter. Metal turns treacherous. What looks like a simple blade or cup can burn like fire in reverse, sticking to skin, stealing heat so fast it feels like betrayal. Out here, tools are lifelines, but if you forget their moods, they become enemies. The mainstream fact in freezing camps: hunters learn to protect skin from metal contact at all costs. Iron, steel, even tin chilled to the night's temperature could freeze to wet flesh in an instant. Touch an axe head bare-handed and it glued itself to you, pulling skin away when you tried to let go. Sip directly from a metal cup and your lips could freeze to the rim, a winter kiss you didn't want. To counter this, hunters wrapped handles in leather bark or cloth. They carried wooden spoons, horn ladles, bone handles. The simple rule: never trust naked metal in naked cold. A quirky tidbit rings through diaries: some hunters kept fur mitt covers with little flaps so they could grip tools without ever baring skin. Others used strips of birch bark as makeshift gloves when repairing traps. In Russian Siberia, trappers sometimes heated their knives briefly near a fire before cutting frozen meat, both to soften the food and to prevent steel from sticking. On the frontier, one trapper swore he avoided disaster by urinating on a frozen axe to loosen it from a log. Practical, if not polite. And a few journals mention hunters marking their tin mugs with soot rings, reminding themselves never to touch the rim directly. It became a black warning label centuries before OSHA. Historians still argue about how severe these metal hazards truly were. Some say frostbite scars and anecdotes are exaggerated, noting that skilled hunters usually avoided bare-skin mistakes. Others argue that repeated minor injuries left real evidence: frost-nipped fingers, scars, even missing bits of skin noted in skeletal remains. Archaeologists find little direct proof metal corrodes flesh, vanishes, but they do find wrapped tool handles in frozen graves, suggesting precautions were deliberate, not decorative. Whether exaggeration or understatement, one fact remains: every hunter knew metal had a personality in winter, and it wasn't friendly. You rise briefly, tugging the axe closer to the firelight. The handle is wrapped in rawhide stained dark with years of use. You trace the edge carefully with your mittened hand, resisting the urge to test bare fingers. The axe looks like wood and steel, but it feels like a warning. The tin cup sitting nearby glints coldly in the firelight, and you imagine your lips welded there, your dignity left behind. You chuckle at yourself, shake your head, and slide the cup deeper into your pack. The sensory anchors sharpen with chill detail. The whine of the axe edge when you shift it. The clink of the cup against a stone. The shiver in your breath as it brushes across the rim of a sawtooth. You hear in all of it the silent caution of the hunter's past: respect the cold, not just in air and snow, but in the very tools that serve you. Another mainstream point beyond skin contact: hunters also had to prevent tools from freezing solid. Traps snapped sluggishly if ice clogged hinges. Knives dulled faster when hacking frozen wood. Gun barrels could frost shut. Solutions were practical: keep gear close to the body, hang traps near the fire, overnight wrap weapons in skins. A hunter who lost his tools to frost wasn't just inconvenienced, he was undone. A fringe tidbit: some Arctic accounts describe licking bone handles deliberately before gripping them, the saliva freezing and creating a temporary glue. Dangerous, yes, but effective for traction in desperate moments. Others tell of using fish skin wraps on knives which stayed pliable even when leather stiffened. And on polar expeditions, men often carried wooden chopsticks as improvised tongs, a bizarre but effective way to avoid frozen lips on tin mugs. Nothing was too odd if it worked. Modern aside, we still warn children not to lick frozen poles in winter, but hunters learned that lesson without playground dares. Even now, ice climbers wrap gear handles, skiers cover metal buckles, and campers bring insulated mugs. Technology has changed, but metal's bad manners haven't. You grin whispering, so the real enemy isn't frost, it's cutlery. Another joke. Imagine explaining frostbite scars by saying the spoon attacked me. And one more muttered toward the dog snoring at your feet. You're lucky, buddy. No thumbs, no frozen knives. His tail flicks once, perhaps smug. You tuck the axe back into its corner, making sure its bite is wrapped and its handle covered. You sip the last of your broth with a wooden spoon, warm and safe. You lie back, and the thought lingers. Survival wasn't just about what you carried, but how you carried it. Wood, bone, leather, these were buffers between you and winter's greed. But the next duty was even stranger. Tools could be managed, but hygiene in frozen tents became its own battle, washing waste and keeping clean when water froze and comfort was a luxury. You settle again into the warmth of hides only to realise there's another question hunters faced, one less glorious than fire building or dog curling. How do you stay clean in a frozen camp? Hygiene may not seem like a survival topic, but in long winters it was as crucial as wood or food. Without it, infections brewed sores, festered, and morale collapsed faster than a poorly pitched tent. Yet washing in sub-zero weather was no simple matter. With water-frozen soap scarce and wind always lurking, cleanliness became a clever dance of improvisation. The mainstream fact hunters across the cold world practiced practical hygiene without full baths. Snow itself was the first tool handfuls rubbed over skin to clean sweat and oils, a brisk, stinging ritual that left you both chilled and oddly refreshed. Melted water when available was rationed for drinking first, but small amounts were used for wiping faces, hands, or even rinsing tools. Sami herders used pine and spruce needles crushed to release resin as a natural scrub and deodorizer. In Arctic communities, moss served as soap sponge and even toilet paper, its absorbency legendary. Frontier hunters often carried a single rag boiled and reused endlessly, wiping down hands after butchering or cooking. It wasn't luxurious, but it was survival-grade clean. A quirky tidbit creeps into the record. Some trappers joked about snow baths, where they stripped briefly to roll in snow after sweating from heavy work. They claimed it prevented chills by drying sweat instantly and scaring the body back to alertness. In Siberia, Evenki hunters chewed spruce resin as a kind of toothbrush gum, scraping teeth clean and freshening breath with pine oils. One Canadian diary describes trappers using gunpowder paste on teeth, abrasive yes, but effective against plaque. It also explains the frequent complaint of chipped enamel, and among Inuit the Quolic oil lamp served a double purpose, warming food and softening frozen fat, which was rubbed into skin as both moisturizer and barrier against frost. Think of it as prehistoric Vaseline smelling faintly of seal. Historians still argue about how much hygiene really mattered in short-term hunting parties. Some argue it was ignored diaries filled with complaints about stink and grime suggest men simply endured filth. Others counter that the many references to snow-rubbing moss and spruce indicate a serious effort to stay at least moderately clean. Archaeologists add little clarity, though the absence of parasites in some burial remains suggests better hygiene than stereotypes allow. Perhaps the truth lies in balance. Hygiene wasn't perfection, but enough maintenance to prevent sickness from outpacing the cold. You perform a little ritual yourself. With your mitten off, you scoop a palmful of snow and rub it briskly across your face. It stings instantly, needles of ice digging into skin, but it wakes you as surely as coffee. You scrub your hands too, feeling grime dissolve into the frost. You grab a strip of spruce twig from your bedding, chew its end until it frays, and use it to clean your teeth. The taste is sharp, resinous, like drinking a forest. You spit into the snow, the sound muffled, the steam curling upward. Primitive, yes, but oddly satisfying. The sensory anchors are intimate. The crunch of snow in your hands, the squeak of resin between teeth, the shiver of cold water evaporating from skin, even the dog shake as your companion imitates you sending a spray of snow crystals across the tent. The air feels cleaner already, though you smell faintly like a pine tree wrapped in leather. Another mainstream point waste management was hygiene too. Hunters couldn't afford to foul camp. Some dug small snow pits for waste covering them each morning. Others designated a latrine log a short walk downwind. Sami camps sometimes placed moss-lined buckets near tents for nights too cold to venture far, emptying them at dawn. These practices weren't just about comfort, they kept sickness at bay. A fringe tidbit adds a smile in some Siberian folklore, leaving waste uncovered in winter risked offending frost spirits who might turn vindictive. In frontier humour, trappers warned each other not to relieve themselves too close to tents. Steam could freeze canvas shut. Diaries mention men competing in absurd games trying to see whose waist froze into the tallest icicle. Crude, yes, but it made bitter nights bearable. Modern aside today, we carry hand sanitizer, biodegradable soap, collapsible toilets. But if you've ever brushed your teeth with cold water in a campsite, or rinsed your hands with snow, you've repeated the same compromises. Hunters didn't aim for spotless, they aimed for functional. You laugh rubbing your beard with numb fingers, so my skincare routine is snow and seal grease, very fashionable. Another joke, toothpaste nope, gunpowder chic. And whispered as the dog rolls happily in the snow you tossed inside, great, now even you smell fresher than me. You lie back down, cheeks tingling, teeth squeaky clean, oddly proud of your crude spa treatment. The cold has been bargained with, once again not beaten but managed. Survival is often about such little victories, the kind you can smile about even as the night deepens. But the next duty was even stranger. Hygiene aside, hunters also relied on clothing tricks, layering sleeping in boots, or not even stuffing garments with moss to turn fabric into yet another weapon against the cold. The fire hums low, your face tingles from its icy scrub, and the night presses on. But no matter how much you eat, how many stones you heat, or how cleverly you arrange the tent's survival in winter, always clung to one final layer: clothing. Hunters knew that garments were not fashion. They were physics stitched and layered into defences against a cold that waited for any weakness. How you dressed, how you slept, even what you stuffed into your boots could decide if you greeted dawn or not. The mainstream fact across northern hunting cultures, layering was the gospel. Sami herders wore reindeer skins, fur in for warmth, fur out when damp adjusting depending on weather. Inuit hunters stitched caribou parkas with the hollow hairs turned inward, trapping heat more efficiently than wool. Siberian evenki layered bark cloth under fur, a crude but effective wind blocker. On the North American frontier, trappers wore wool shirts under buckskin coats topped with heavy blankets. But at night, rules shifted. Sometimes you kept boots on to prevent them from freezing solid. Other times you stripped them off, tucking them under bedding so they thawed by morning. The decision was strategy, not comfort. A quirky tidbit rustles in some trappers stuffed dry moss or grass inside boots to wick away sweat and keep toes dry overnight. Sami traditions sometimes had children sleep with mittens still untied at the wrists so they didn't slip off. Inuit families in the coldest stretches even used double parkas and underlayer of thinner hide, overlaid with a heavy outer coat, creating an air pocket of trapped warmth. And one Canadian journal mentions men lining their hats with rabbit fur so ears stayed warm even when the hat froze stiff. Hunters were not just wearing clothes, they were building microhabitats. Historians still argue about whether hunters really slept fully clothed or partly stripped. Some argue clothing was worn constantly, layer on layer, because redressing in the morning risked frostbite. Others suggest hunters sometimes loosened or removed layers while sleeping to let garments dry, since sweat-soaked clothes froze into boards if left on. Archaeological evidence from frozen burials suggests both practices. Some bodies found layered to the point of immobility, others wrapped in blankets with outer clothes folded nearby. The scholarly debate circles the same fire: were clothes warmth, or were clothes also a liability when damp likely answer hunters adapted nightly? You shift under the hides considering your own layers, socks stiff with frost off, mittens damp from melted snow, hung near the fire, shirt clammy, loosened then tucked back under the fur so it can dry against your body's own heat. You decide to keep boots on but unlaced, padding them with moss you pulled earlier. It feels ridiculous, like sleeping with two small log cabins on your feet, but the logic is clear: if boots freeze, tomorrow is ruined before it begins. The sensory anchors are tactile now. The scratch of wool against skin, the rustle of hide as you shift, the faint squeak of frozen seams thawing near your belly heat. The dog shifts closer, pressing fur against your calf, the ultimate extra layer. Outside, snow sighs as it drifts down the wall, insulating your camp further. Even the air smells of leather and resin, a wardrobe perfume of necessity. Another mainstream point clothing was often customized for sleep. Some hunters wrapped their heads with scarves so no breath escaped, leaving only tiny nose holes. Others tied belts over coats to keep heat compressed, like wrapping a blanket tighter around your core. Children often wore oversized garments to bed sleeves stuffed with spare moss for insulation. Nothing was wasted, every fibre was either clothing, bedding, or fuel. A fringe tidbit: in some camps, hunters wore mismatched socks on purpose. One wool, one fur, believing the different textures prevented frost from creeping evenly. In Siberia, men sometimes stuffed small heated stones into pockets, letting warmth spread through clothing seams. And in Norse sagas, there are whispers of warriors greasing their legs with animal fat before pulling on trousers, claiming it both insulated and made the pants slide on easier in the cold. Archaeologists haven't confirmed this, but it's not impossible, and frankly it sounds exactly like something you'd try on the fifth night of a blizzard. Modern aside, you might wear fleece pyjamas or thermals, but you're doing the same thing, choosing fabrics that wick, trap and layer. Hunters didn't use technical jargon, but they mastered the principles: air pockets, dryness and insulation. They were the original gear testers, with stakes much higher than a chilly morning commute. You smile into the blanket. Congratulations, I'm now a human onion layered pungent and hard to peel. Another joke. If I add one more layer, I'll need hinges, and whispered toward the dog pressed against you. At least you came pre-layered. His ear flicks unimpressed but warm. You tug your hood lower, tuck the hides tighter, and let the combined power of cloth fur and moss cocoon you. Winter has pressed its full argument, and you've answered with every trick: firestone, snow walls, dogs, food rituals, and now clothes. Dawn feels nearer even if hours away, but the final duty is softer still when the fire dims, when voices quiet, when layers weigh heavy. The body and mind drift into the long, slow surrender of sleep itself, not just as rest, but as survival's final bargain with the night. The tent has become a cathedral of silence, the last embers breathing in low rhythm, and your body layered and wrapped finally concedes. Sleep here is not leisure, it is a strategy, the final chore of the night. Hunters understood that to rest was not to waste time, but to store energy like fat in the fire of the body, ready for whatever dawn demanded. Sleep was both surrender and survival, and in the frozen night it took on a gravity far heavier than a feather pillow ever could. The mainstream fact across cultures, hunters treated sleep as essential fuel, often planning their schedules around the cold's demands. In Sami camps, families gathered close, sharing not just warmth, but breath itself, turning the air thick and survivable. Inuit igloos were designed so sleepers lay on raised platforms of snow and skins, their heat pooling upward like a second hearth. Frontier hunters, often alone, buried themselves under piles of hides, treating sleep as the one luxury they could not afford to skip. Sleep wasn't optional, it was a shared agreement between body fire and tent. A quirky tidbit whispers in some diaries note that trappers sang themselves to sleep, or hummed tunelessly into their scarves, not for melody, but for self-soothing warmth. Sami children were taught to fall asleep listening to the rhythm of reindeer bells, their steady chime acting like a lullaby. And in northern Siberia, hunters sometimes set a small stick on the coals as a crude alarm clock the moment the stick burned through, and fell, the sound would wake them for fire duty. Primitive snooze button, winter edition. Historians still argue whether people in these camps truly achieved deep sleep or lived in constant half-waking states. Some evidence suggests segmented rest-waking every few hours to 10 chores was the norm. Others argue that exhaustion forced people into profound slumber despite the risks. Ethnographic accounts paint both pictures: hunters waking often, yet also describing dreams vivid enough to feel like journeys. Sleep in these frozen worlds was not uniform but opportunistic, a patchwork quilt of naps, dozes, and deeper rests stitched together. You ease yourself down fully, now hides, tucked up scarf, damp but warming boots, half-laced and padded with moss. The dog, generous in his own way, sprawls against your thigh, radiating fur heat like a small furnace. You let your chest rise and fall, slowly matching the rhythm of the cold sighs. The tent creaks, the snow wall presses, the world leans in with its heavy stillness. The sensory anchors drift towards softness, the slow crack of an ember folding in on itself, the distant sigh of wind muffled by your snow wall into a lullaby instead of a threat, the steady pulse of the dog's breath, an unspoken metronome. Even your own heartbeat slows until it becomes another percussion in winter's orchestra. Another mainstream fact sleep in cold camps was communal engineering. Families arranged themselves in patterns, parents at the edges, children in the centre, hunters with dogs curled around feet, even elders positioned close to fire for easier waking. Alone you improvise differently, using clothing stones and the dog as companions. But the principle is identical. The body was meant to sleep not in isolation but in conspiracy with others, be they kin beasts or fire. A fringe tidbit, some accounts describe hunters deliberately dreaming of warmth as a mental trick. They imagined summer meadows, campfires, or even imagined feasts, believing the brain's imagery could coax the body into releasing heat. In Norse sagas, men were said to invoke dream spirits to keep them alive through long nights, half folklore, half coping mechanism. And explorers' diaries tell of phantom hearths' dreams, so vivid that men woke reaching for non-existent flames. Was it madness? Or was it survival's subconscious assistant? The debate remains. Modern aside, you may fall asleep tonight to podcasts or music letting voices lull your brain into safety. That's not new, it's the echo of ancient bedtime chants, fire sounds and whispered stories. Humans have always needed more than heat to sleep. They've needed reassurance, ritual rhythm. Sleep is not weakness, it is trust in your preparations. You grin faintly in the dark, muttering, "Congratulations. I've turned sleep into my last survival skill." Another joke, soft. "If I snore loud enough, maybe Frost will get scared off." And a final whisper to the dog already twitching in dreams. "Fine, you win, best bedmate, but I'm still hogging the blanket." You let go at last. The body softens eyelids, heavy mind slowing to a crawl. Outside, Frost continues its patient work, but inside you've sealed a truce. Sleep arrives not as a luxury, but as a bargain you will rest. And in return, dawn will come. And as you slip under one truth lingers hunters never conquered frozen nights in tents. They endured them layer by layer, ember by ember, story by story, dream by dream, until winter itself grew tired of testing them. So here you are, wrapped in hides and history, listening not only to your own breath, but to centuries of the others who did the same. Across tundra forest, plain and mountain, hunters lay in their tents, watching smoke curl upward, watching snow drift sideways, feeling frost tap the canvas like a patient creditor. They knew, as you know now, that survival was never about one trick. It was about weaving dozens together until the night finally blinked first. Think of the fire still whispering, the stones radiating faint warmth, the snow wall guarding your fragile canvas. Think of your body not just wrapped in clothes and fur, but wrapped in calories from a greasy stew, wrapped in laughter from a half-told story, wrapped in rituals you sketched in ash. Think of the dog pressed at your side, a reminder that warmth is never only human. Think of the rhythm of night chores, wake, stoke, sleep, repeat, until rhythm itself became its own lullaby. The world outside remains sharp and frozen. Branches groan, snow sighs, frost prowls, wind hums. But inside your body softens and your mind drifts. The tent becomes less a structure of poles and cloth, and more a cocoon of sound, warmth and patience. And as sleep carries you, the lesson rests clear. Hunters did not fight the cold so much as negotiate with it, crafting bargains out of stones, moss food and faith. Each night was a conversation, and each morning was proof the argument had been won. Let your breath fall slower now, let the images fade. The fire's glow sinks into stillness, the dog's breathing anchors the silence, and the canvas darkens into quiet.